Chapter 1. Ask, and it shall be given you, seek, and ye shall find, knock, and it shall be opened unto you. For every one that asketh, receiveth, and he that seeketh, findeth, and to him that knocketh, it shall be opened. Matthew 7 verses 7-8. Tell me again, Graham? Susan Lavinia Holmes pleaded, plopping into a chair. I want to hear the story again? Susan, you have heard this story at least a dozen times, Alana Holmes groaned, smoothing her skirt as she sat in the parlor of her ancestral home. Yes, but maybe this time I'll find a clue from the story that will set me in the right direction. I have to know what really happened. Susan's grandmother shook her head of white curls, but her pale blue eyes were bright. All right, I'll tell you again, but take notes. It's just a silly happening here in the mountains of Georgia, and it worked out well enough. Susan crossed her legs where she sat on the white ottoman in her grandmother's stately home and leaned forward for the retelling of an age-old family tale. Her soft blue eyes sparkled with excitement, and she leaned in, wanting to catch every word. At 24, Susan had finished her education and was currently between jobs as she tried to figure out what she wanted to do next. Her dual degree in sociology and education gave her a wide range of opportunities, but right now, on this warm Georgia summer's day, she wanted to figure out where the stray horses her grandmother had found so many years ago had come from, and what they could possibly have to do with a missing farmer from a bygone age. As you know, Alana began, I was a student at the college by the falls. It was spring, and though I had paid my tuition in full, all students were required to work for the college during their tenure there. I chose to work on the farm with the horses, as I'd grown up with them. The old woman smiled, recalling fond memories and old friends. Susan nodded, resting her pert chin on her hand as she listened intently. All students had to work back then when the college was fully self-sufficient? Yes, I always thought it was a shame when that ended. I may not have been raised to hard work, but I learned a great deal about myself and my abilities as a young woman working for the school. Young people today need a bit more purpose in their life, if you ask me. The older woman in the floral print dress gave her granddaughter a significant look. I know, Susan rolled her eyes. You think I'm wasting my time trying to solve this mystery, especially since it has been a cold case for over 50 years. If professionals haven't been able to solve the case in this amount of time, I don't see how you think you will do it over the summer. After all, reading Nancy Drew books does not make you a detective. Susan giggled, brushing a strand of soft brown hair from her eyes and tapping a finger to her lips. She had loved the Nancy Drew books growing up, and with her last name, she had devoured all of Conan Doyle's tales. No harm in trying, she urged. Now tell me the story. Alana shook her head, but the smile playing around her lips told her granddaughter that she enjoyed telling the story again. My friend Gary and I were out hiking, the old woman began. There are many trails up behind the falls that meander into the national forest. We had been out most of the day when I heard something snort. Gary thought it was a bear, but I was convinced it was a horse and plunged straight through the undergrowth to find not one, but two horses, grazing in a small clearing. Neither had halter or bridle and looked as if they were completely wild. One was a stallion and the other a colt. Susan couldn't contain her excitement. Even as a child, this had been her favorite story. Who's telling this story anyway? Her grandmother pursed her lips, slanting a look at the pretty young woman her gangly granddaughter had become. Go on then, Susan urged. Alana's eyes sparked again as she remembered the tale. Well, we couldn't just leave the animals there in the forest. There was no telling what might happen to them. That colt was so skinny, and his tail was matted with thistle and burdock, I didn't know what to think. Of course, the problem was how were we supposed to bring them home? After a bit of discussion, I convinced Gary we could make a halter from our belts, and pretty soon I had that pretty bay paint stallion in hand. He was a decent horse, really, a bit shy to start, but smart enough to know that I was trying to help. That little black and white colt fell in behind its companion, and we started for the barns. And you never found out who they belonged to? Susan prompted excitedly. Not for sure. No. Grandma Holmes agreed. Some of the town folks had seen a man in the mountains a few times with a bay paint, but they didn't know who he was, and no matter how the police and posse tried to find him, the only thing they found was a banged-up moonshine still and a broken shotgun. The sheriff seemed to think there had been some foul play between rival moonshiners, but without a body or other trace, they didn't know what to think. "Is that why they let you keep Israel and Oreo?" "The two horses." Susan still couldn't believe that the horses had been turned over to her grandmother without any fuss at all. No one had tried to claim them, or even inquire about them. After the sheriff spoke with Gary and me and got our report about finding the horses, no one even batted an eye. "They were mine to keep if I wanted them," and even as unruly as that crazy bay paint proved to be, he was one of the most beautiful horses I have ever owned. Susan was too young to have ever seen the horse her grandmother dubbed Israel, but she had seen plenty of pictures. Her grandmother had gone from student to wife and mother in the few short years after taking in the paint and his young companion, and in time, life had become so busy that her old horse had become more of a companion than anything else. "He was a good horse," Grandma Holmes mused. "I'm glad I'm the one who found him." She turned sad blue eyes toward Susan. "Now you be careful poking around into things you know nothing about." Times were different back then, and those of us at the college were often warned about walking into the woods in case we came across someone hiding out up there. Back then, moonshiners were common, and they didn't take well to anyone stumbling on their still. "You agree with the police, then, don't you?" Susan asked. "You think the owner of Israel and Oreo was a moonshiner who came to odds with his competition?" "It did make the most sense," Alana agreed. "That's why I don't understand your fascination with the painted ponies and the missing man." Susan shrugged. She had always been interested in this story. She had been fascinated by the mystery of where the horses had come from, who the man with the still had been, or where he had gone for as long as she could remember. With nothing else pressing in her life, she was determined to solve the mystery and put this chapter of her family's history to rest. David Watkins walked along the edge of the falls, following an ancient trail that may have been there since before the first white man had traversed the wilds of Georgia. He had been over the trail at least a dozen times this summer, but no matter how many trips he took, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. The old cabin, a hangover from his family's somewhat seedy past, drew him as a lodestone draws steel, and he had to go over what he knew one more time. Slipping below the moss-covered eaves of the old structure, he blinked into the cool darkness amidst the dank logs and earthy smell of the dirt floor. David had been visiting this cabin in the national forest for years, his mind drifting back to the days as a boy when his father would bring him to the cabin looking for clues. The Watkins had been known throughout the northeastern region of Georgia as some of the finest bootleggers of their time, but that wasn't what drew him and his father each summer. The cabin's draw had more to do with the disappearance of David's paternal grandfather in the 1960s than the seedy reputation of whiskey runners from a bygone era. What happened? David mused for the 100th time. It had never made sense to him that his grandfather would have been making rot-gut liquor into the early 1960s, but apparently, old habits died hard. At least that was what most of the townspeople believed. The original Watkins clan had congregated in the high hills of Georgia as farmers shifting to bootlegging as the Roaring Twenties swept the land. David ran his hands through his sandy blonde hair, taking in every aspect of the old shack, with his dark caramel-colored eyes. There had to be more to his grandfather's disappearance than a simple scuffle over corn liquor. Pulling a sheaf of paper from a shoulder bag, David flipped through the pages, scanning the familiar information. The police report was no help at all. The only salient point was the reference to a student from the college downstream finding two horses that may have belonged to a rival bootlegger. What happened? David asked again, frustration ruffling his usual calm. Where did you go? The puzzle of his grandfather's disappearance had bothered David's grandmother right up until the day she had died, leaving this mysterious legacy for David to unwind. Heaving a heavy sigh, David turned walking back out of the little hut and retraced his steps, following the stream along the familiar path and through the quiet campus far below as his brain turned the problem over again. David Watkins needed to talk to the woman that had found the horses. He needed to hear the story from her and find a way to glean any remnant of information that might bring this mystery to a close and put his grandmother's soul to rest. There had to be a clue somewhere. There had to be someone who had seen, heard, or felt something that would, at long last, solve the mystery of the disappearance of Harcourt Watkins. As David made his way to the lower parking area, along the same stream that poured more than 100 feet over the sheer wall of rock that created the falls, he searched his phone for the address of the woman he needed to see. He could only pray that she was still living and that she could tell him something. Climbing into his beat-up truck, David cracked a window against the sweltering Georgia sun and turned the key. One way or another he was determined to solve the mystery that had for so long defined his family's legacy, overshadowing all aspects of joy, jubilation, and cheer. A missing grandfather, a moonshine still, 2 stray horses, and a case as cold as the air conditioning spewing from his truck vents. David had his work cut out for him, but he knew he had to pull the threads together and solve the case, putting old ghosts to rest. The GPS announced that he had arrived, and David peered out the window at the massive white house nestled among the big trees. The old home, with its stately columns and immaculately sculpted lawn, was not what he had expected to find at the end of his short drive. He was sure that by now the old woman would be in a nursing facility or have moved to Florida, not still residing in the fancy Victorian home at the top of the hill. Parking on the street, David grabbed his journal and trotted up the stairs, ringing the doorbell expectantly. "Hello?" A dark-haired young woman opened the door, and David tipped his head curiously. "I'm looking for Alana Holmes," he said, puzzled by the young woman's appearance. The woman he was looking for had to be in her late 60s, possibly 70s by now. "That's my grandmother." The young woman smiled. "May I ask what this is about?" Her bright blue eyes took in the leather packet in his hands, before meeting his warm brown gaze. "I'd like to talk to her about the horses she found back in '66, the young man met her gaze boldly. "Is she available?" Susan scowled at the man on the other side of the screen door. He was tall, dressed casually, and had striking features under a mop of sandy blonde hair. "Are you selling something?" Susan snipped. "No, I'm just looking for some details about the day she found the horses in the national forest. I'm doing research." He knew the words were bordering on a lie, but he didn't want to be turned away without a chance to interview Mrs. Holmes. The Holmes family, known as one of the wealthiest in the area, were said to be standoffish at best. "Susan, who is it?" Another voice punched into the heat of the sweltering Georgia summer. "Invite them in for a glass of sweet tea. It's too hot to keep folks standing out there on the porch." Reluctantly Susan opened the door. "This way, please." She let the man walk into the entry hall, grinning as his dark eyes grew wide with surprise. The old family home often had that effect on people upon entry. Over the years, the family had modernized their old Victorian house, but kept the elegance and regal appointments of the time along the way. Susan's family had made their money as peach farmers, and over the generations had built an elegant home that fit the North Georgia region perfectly. The polished marble floor, the sweeping stairs, the warm rich woods of the office across the hall, all blended in a simple sophistication that was commonplace to her. "If you'll follow me," Susan led the man across the hall to a sitting room, where her grandmother was resting in an upright, pink wing-backed chair. "Grandmother, this is..." Susan stopped, realizing she didn't know the man's name. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name." "Watkins," the young man smiled, transforming his serious face. "David Elias Watkins." "Watkins." Susan and her grandmother expostulated at the same time. "What on earth do you want here?" David felt his temper rise to a slow burn as both women stared at him. His family had been treated this way ever since his grandfather's disappearance. Clenching his fingers into fists, he opened his mouth, speaking calmly. "I would like to ask you a few questions about that day in '66, when you found the horses above the falls. I'm trying to uncover what really happened to my grandfather all those years ago." Susan stared at the young man who stood before her grandmother, hands clenched as he battled his anger. She had heard the rumors for years about the Watkins family. It was widely known that old Mr. Watkins had been a notorious moonshiner and that even as an old man he ran a still in the mountains of the Chattahoochee National Forest. Most of the people in town who knew the story believed that old Mr. Watkins had quarreled with a rival and the argument had turned violent. No one could agree, however, on whether Watkins had murdered his rival and fled, or if it had gone the other way and his body still mouldered somewhere in the far hills. Your grandfather was a moonshiner and lawbreaker, Alana said, her bright eyes scanning the young man. Still, it isn't right that no one knows what happened to him. The old woman waved a hand toward a chair. Sit and we'll chat. She lifted her eyes to her granddaughter. Susan, why don't you bring that tea I suggested earlier? Perhaps Mr. Watkins will help us figure out how Israel and Oreo ended up wandering the hills on their own all those years ago. Susan gaped at her grandmother. Only minutes ago, the old tyrant had declared Susan's mission a waste of time, and now she was all for Mr. Watkins picking up the thread. The mystery belonged to her, and she had no intention of sharing it with the handsome young man sitting awkwardly in her grandmother's parlor. Go on then, Alana urged, shooing her like a pesky child. I'll chat with Mr. Watkins while you're gone. Thank you. David looked between the two women, trying to relax as he sat in the high-backed chair opposite the senior Holmes. As you know, my grandfather disappeared right around the time you found those two horses. Unfortunately, in all that time, we have not been able to find a single clue that would set our family on the path of discovering what happened to Harcourt Watkins. Your grandpa was no saint, Alana said, lifting her chin. He was a moonshiner and was earning money in a very unsavory manner. Yes, the old woman waved her hand in the air before David could argue. I know moonshining was a pastime for many in this part of the state, especially since it was a dry county, but selling it without paying taxes was highly illegal. And before you try to argue your grandfather's case, the old woman leaned forward, pinning David with her eyes. I saw him myself walking through campus with his shotgun in hand. He looked like some wild mountain man before the invention of the bath. You actually saw him? David slid forward on the edge of his seat. In '66 you saw my grandfather alive? We students were under strict orders not to traverse the woods behind the falls back then. Alana shook her head. The board was afraid we would stumble onto a still and get shot. It wasn't uncommon to see a few scruffy men traipse through the campus, with a handcart full of hooch and a shotgun over their shoulder. They looked beyond horrid, the old woman shivered. But you went hiking anyway, David smiled, liking the pluck of this old woman. No matter what her views on his grandfather's behavior, she could know something that would help him put this age-old mystery to rest. No matter what anyone had said for all those years, his recently departed grandmother had never believed a single rumor. Tea? The pretty woman from a few moments ago walked back into the room carrying a tray full of shimmering glasses full of the iced amber delight. She was an attractive woman with blue eyes and light brown hair. Her appearance seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Thank you. David cleared his throat as a strange sensation swarmed him, like a group of agitated bees, and he looked up to meet bright blue eyes full of irritation. Silently, he reached up, taking the proffered glass, his fingers grazing hers as they met halfway. A shiver raced down David's spine and he gasped, gripping the sweat-beaded glass tighter. The last thing he needed to do was drop his drink in this fancy house. Susan, do sit down, Alana barked at her granddaughter. Put the tray on the table. What on earth has gotten into you? The old woman shook her head of perfectly coiffed white curls. Susan was just asking me to tell her the story of when I found the horses. She's far too curious about such things if you ask me. It isn't safe for a young single woman to be so curious. Susan almost choked on her sip of sweet tea, coughing and spluttering as she sat it on a coaster on the side table and stared at her grandmother. How can you say that when you're the one who found the horses in the first place? Despite the orders against going into that forest. I just want to understand what happened. I'll find out too, she added, glaring at Mr. Watkins. Alana Holmes looked between her granddaughter and the young man who had finally gotten his emotions under control. Perhaps you and Mr. Watkins can work together, she mused, sipping from her frosty glass. That way I won't worry about you so much. Blue eyes pinned Susan from above the rim of the tall crystal glass, making the younger woman squirm. Susan's eyes grew wide at her grandmother's suggestion. Alana Holmes knew better than anyone how much Susan wanted to solve this mystery, alone. She had been investigating quietly for years, reading news reports, police journals, and digging for every clue she could find. Gram? I'm sorry, Mr. Watkins placed his icy glass on the table before him. I work alone. That's a pity, Alana said, her eyes dancing. It's a shame you have completely wasted your time. She turned, looking at Susan, a mock sorrow on her face. I might even have shared a secret I never told a soul. Silence descended on the room like a shroud, covering everyone in a heavy, oppressive weight. David turned, looking at the young woman to his right. She was wearing a simple yellow shirt and denim capri pants that fit her slim curves perfectly. Her brown hair was loose, falling over her shoulders in soft waves, and she looked shocked. Perhaps, he stuttered, his eyes never leaving her blue gaze, perhaps we could work together. Susan glared at the young man, matching his amber stare with a flash of her own. She had worked too hard on this mystery to have to share it with someone she didn't know. With someone who was trying to clear the name of a notorious scoundrel. No, Susan pressed the words between tight lips. I guess we'll never know then. Mrs. Holmes lifted her glass of tea with a shrug. I'm sorry you wasted your time. She looked back at the young man, whose brows were knit in a hard scowl. David sagged in his chair. He had worked so hard to compile the information surrounding his grandfather's disappearance, and his heart ached as he remembered his grandmother's tenacious disbelief in her husband's wrongdoing. No matter how many people whispered disparities against Harcourt, grandmother Watkins had never given in. She was so positive that her husband's disappearance had nothing to do with making moonshine that she had infected her grandson with the same fervent faith as hers. Closing his eyes, David willed his heart to settle, then looked at the pretty young woman. Please, he pleaded, I'm doing this for my grandmother. She never believed any of the things people said about Grandpa Watkins. Right up to the end she was certain he had done nothing wrong. Susan squirmed in her seat, a feeling of unease sliding down her spine as the man's eyes collided with hers. He seemed so sincere. So honest, that guilt nibbled at her insides. I've worked so hard to find the answer, she stammered. You need help, Alana snapped. Now stop hedging and give in. You both have the same goals, might as well pool resources, and get on with it. The old woman's eyes flashed, and a glimpse of the tough adventurous woman she had been shown through. Susan couldn't believe her grandmother's words. She had never known Alana to be so sharp before. You can have all the credit, David urged. Please don't send me away empty-handed. Susan felt her resolve melt under the onslaught of pleas. All right, but it's my case. A soft huff from her grandmother's chair made both young people turn, caught in the old woman's gaze of disgust. Case, you'd think you were detectives, or something. This case has been cold for years, and why two silly young people think they can find the answer when professionals couldn't is beyond me, but if you are determined, I'll tell you everything I know. She turned her bright eyes, pinning David to his chair once more. You need to promise me something though. Anything. David practically bounced in his seat. You have to protect my granddaughter. She waved a dismissive hand at Susan's outraged gasp. Yes, I know you are a modern woman who doesn't need a man to look out for her, but we were made man and woman for a reason, and there's a plan to God making most men stronger than us girls. Now both of you settle down, and I'll tell you every detail of what happened that day on the mountain. Even things I thought I had imagined. David let his eyes wander to the young woman sitting stiff and straight in the chair across from him. He could see the anger dancing in her eyes, but something inside told him that old Mrs. Holmes was right. Just because this case had been abandoned so long ago did not mean that the parties involved weren't still lurking somewhere in the shadows, and if they got too close, danger could be a real issue. If they had worked so hard to cover their tracks back then, what would they do now if two amateur sleuths began to poke around where they weren't wanted? Deep down the iron entered his soul, and David knew he would do whatever it took to keep one Miss Susan Holmes safe. Susan looked between her grandmother and the sandy-haired man sipping tea in her family's home. He was a nice-looking man, but right now, she would have liked nothing better than to toss him out on his ear. She didn't need a meddlesome Watkins interfering with her investigation. She could do this on her own. Pulling her eyes away from the handsome, well-chiseled face, she glared at her grandmother who sipped her tea innocently. Graham had never before indicated there was anything more to the story than what she had told them for years. Was Alana Holmes going to divulge a golden nugget of truth, or was she simply trying to ensure that Susan would work with the young man with the nosy disposition? Graham, as sophisticated as she was still very old-fashioned in some ways. Susan didn't need a man to keep an eye on her. Susan lifted her glass of iced tea to hide her smile behind her beverage. Perhaps she didn't need a man to help her solve this mystery, but that didn't mean she couldn't garner something from the partnership. Her blue eyes strayed to the leather journal the young man was opening, and she felt her heart zing with excitement at the idea of seeing what tidbits were hidden within. She would glean any information she could from David Watkins, then run with it until she had solved the age-old mystery of the lost horses of Toccoa Falls and the missing moonshiner that had left so many in a mess. Susan Holmes was a mystery solver. She would follow every lead until the whole town knew she had found the answers. A soft shiver raced through her, pooling in Susan's stomach as she lifted her eyes from the journal only to have them captured by the keen warm eyes of Mr. Watkins. This was bound to be the adventure of a lifetime if Susan played her cards just right. "So what is this big secret you never told anyone?" Susan wrenched her eyes away from the handsome man and turned to her grandmother. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" "Because I wasn't sure if I really saw it." Graham snapped her eyes between the two younger people. "I was focused on the horses, and you know there are all kinds of critters up in those woods." "You never told anyone?" Susan asked, her brows furrowing. "No, I asked Gary if he had seen anything, but he said all he saw were the horses. It didn't seem important at the time, but now I don't know." Chapter 2. Two are better than one. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. Ecclesiastes 4 verses 9 to 12. "Your notes are very comprehensive." Susan's voice was reluctantly encouraging. "There are even notes here I haven't seen before." "I've interviewed my whole family," David replied, stuffing his hands in his pockets. Twice he had nearly lost his battle as he resisted the urge to push a strand of dark hair away from Susan's face. Together they stood over a dark rich wooden desk in a decidedly masculine office off the foyer. David's lips twitched as the young woman ducked her head peering at his journal, and that same stubborn strand of hair fell along her heart-shaped face. "It hasn't always been easy." The young man spoke. "Some felt that my grandfather got what he deserved, while others swear he was a good law-abiding man, who never sold moonshine. They all agree he was peaceful, whatever his other shortcomings might have been." "What do you think about what Graham said?" Susan looked up, meeting his eyes. "Do you really think she saw something the day she found Israel and Oreo?" David shrugged. "I don't know. The forest is thick now, but people camp, hike, and hunt in there all the time. Maybe it was just a flash from some hiker walking by. I can't believe it could be anything else." Susan bit her bottom lip, pondering the notion. Grandma Holmes was convinced that she had seen a flash of light in the woods, but what did that mean exactly? A car never would have made it up there, would it? Even before the dam upstream had burst, there were very few roads into the forest. "Do you think you could find the spot where your grandmother found the horses?" David asked absently, his eyes fixed on Susan's glistening lips. "I mean, we could take a look around and see if we find anything up there. It's crazy," he added, turning his back and pacing to a bookshelf. "Maybe if we look at it with fresh eyes, we might get a feeling for something." "A feeling?" Susan placed her knuckles flat on her hips. "A feeling? How is that supposed to help?" She threw her hands in the air. "Maybe we should just call in a psychic, and they'll be able to walk us to your grandfather's grave." "We don't even know if he's dead." David's voice rose and he wheeled, glaring at the beautiful woman still standing by the desk. "That's the problem, no one knows where he is, or what happened to him. I've spent years watching my grandmother grieve the loss of her husband, but she couldn't even put a marker up in his memory because she didn't know what had happened to him." All of the frustration of years spent wondering spilled over, and his light brown eyes sparked with anger. "If only I could have put her mind to rest. If only there had been answers. We buried her last month under a stone bearing 2 names, but no dates for Pap. Do you know how infuriating that is?" Susan took a step back, the force of David's passion washing over her like a wave. "What if you find out something you don't want to know? What if everything the people of this town have whispered for years is true?" David sagged under the young woman's words. Then at least we'll have the truth, and I can move on. I promised my grandmother I would find out what happened to Pap Pap. I can't quit now. Something turned over in Susan's heart, and though she was still determined to solve the mystery herself, she felt a softening toward the young man with the sand-colored hair. Come on, she groaned, grabbing her keys. I'll take you to the place where Graham found Israel and Oreo. I hope you aren't afraid of a hike though. It isn't easy to get to. David followed Susan out through the kitchen to a small parking area at the back of the house and smiled at the Jeep Wrangler sitting, top down, under a tree. I take it this is yours? He raised a brow, examining the bright blue 4x4. Yep, I like the hills and get out there as much as I can. Susan slipped behind the wheel, and David hurried to jump in the passenger seat as the engine roared. He barely had time to buckle up before Miss Holmes was tearing out of the driveway and headed for the mountain road that brought people the back way into the forest. A warm breeze ruffled his hair as they sped through town, past the library, and down one long hill only to charge up the other. You love this kind of thing, don't you? David smiled as the young woman focused on the road, her dark hair blowing on the wind. Pretty much. Susan didn't look at the man. She was focused on where they were going. This was the easy part of the trek. Stealing a glance at her companion, she wondered if he would be up to the rest of it. The man was tall, lean, and looked fit, but you couldn't always tell. David gripped the grab bar over the glove box, his knuckles going white as the woman behind the wheel whipped the Jeep up a dusty mountain trail. She didn't seem to believe in doing anything slow, and they jumped, jostled, and jolted over ruts. Still, he couldn't help but smile. He had been over these roads many times himself, and fast or slow, they never got any better. Soon they were winding in among the tall pines, dipping into a low valley that led toward the stream that raced to the falls far below. At one time an earthen dam held back the water that rushed toward the 100-foot drop, but it had burst in a tragic torrent, taking far too many good lives with it. Now the stream ran, uninhibited, to the valley far below. We're almost to the staging area, Susan shouted over the rattle and clatter of the Jeep. I have my backpack and water with me. She jerked her thumb behind her, and he glanced back to see a bright orange backpack. He should have thought to grab his own before leaving the fancy house. In a matter of minutes, Susan swung the Jeep into a dirt patch under the pines and hopped out into the dim shade of the big trees. Aren't you worried about someone stealing something? David nodded toward the open roof as he pried his fingers from the grab bar. There isn't anything in it to take once I grab my pack. You can lock your journal in the glove box if you want though. Susan's eyes scanned the leather book that David clutched to his chest. She wanted to see every page in that tiny tome. I'll keep it with me, the man said, stuffing it into the front of his shirt and making Susan's fingers itch to open the journal. Grabbing her pack to occupy her hands, Susan Holmes swung the straps over her shoulders and turned toward a dim trail leading into a dark valley. She had been here so many times before that she probably could have made the trek with her eyes closed. I don't think I've ever been here. David gazed around him at the canopy above. It's miles from my grandfather's cabin. Cabin? Susan stopped so suddenly that David walked into her, scrabbling to keep from tripping down the hill. His right arm shot out, instinctively grasping the young woman to him, but her forward momentum and his inattention tipped them over the crest, like a bowling ball dropping into the gutter. Oh! Susan cried out, feeling herself losing her grip on terra firma as she began to fall. The world spun, the ground rose up, her whole body twisted, landing with a soft woof onto the young man, who tried to tuck her into his chest as they tumbled down the small rise, landing with a soggy plop in a truculent tributary. I am so sorry. David opened his eyes, water gushing up the back of his neck, gasping as startled blue eyes met his. The cold water of the mountain stream seeped into his back, as warmth trickled into David's soul from where the young woman rested on his chest. Susan Holmes had landed on his torso, pushing him into the rocky bottom of the shallow stream. She was so close, her face only inches from his as a slow smile broke across her features. A contagious laugh broke from the young woman's lips, splashing over David like the icy water racing under his back and bubbling in his chest until it gushed from his mouth like a fountain. Your back is soaked, Susan managed as she finally broke the hypnotic gaze that held her, pushing off until her feet splashed down on the pebbles, her sturdy hiking boots gripping the slick stream bed. Offering her hand, Susan felt his strong grip in hers, and she anchored her heels pulling as he came to his feet. "Are you hurt?" David's voice purred. "You didn't hit anything, did you?" He lifted his eyes to the small hill they had tumbled down, hoping there had been no major protuberances on the trail. Susan's soft laugh returned, and she shook her head, noting the twigs and leaves sticking out of his soft locks. "I'm good," she grinned. "Do you want to go back and do this on a day when you aren't dripping wet?" "No," David felt the blush rise up his cheeks. "I'd just as soon get this done." Splashing out of the ankle-deep water, Susan headed for the opposite shore, gesturing for David to follow. "Maybe you'll dry off a little before we have to get back in the jeep." Her voice was full of unuttered laughter. "If not, I guess I'll air dry on the trip home." Another mile and the unlikely pair dropped into another valley, this one spotted with young growth and filled with lush grass, watered by the constant trickle that spread across the low land. "This is it," Susan spoke. "This is where Graham found Israel." Susan rested her hands on her hips, stretching as she tried to dispel the feeling of Mr. Watkins's hands on her sides. "Right here?" "Yep." She and her old friend Gary were following this trail and found the horses knee-deep in grass right here. Susan lifted a hand, pointing into the lush growth that filled the valley. David turned in a slow circle, his lightweight pants already beginning to dry in the warm Georgia sun. "There's nothing here?" "What did you expect?" Susan rolled her eyes. "I've been over every inch of this spot and have never found a single clue. I can't even begin to imagine where Graham would have seen that flash of color she mentioned today." Susan scowled, wondering why her grandmother had never told her that tidbit before. "We should set out a grid and track everything on it." Again David turned in place, pulling the journal from under his shirt and flipping to a blank page. Although his back was soaked through, the water hadn't swamped his chest where the precious book had been stashed. In a matter of seconds, he had sketched out the small bowl-shaped valley, marking off any big trees and unusual landmarks as guides, then created a grid. "I'll start here," he pointed at the sketch. "You start over there, and we'll work our way toward each other." Susan glared at the man, words begging to be freed from her pursed lips at his interference, but something deep inside told her that this was a good plan. "Why don't I take this side?" she sassed. "You go over there. If that's what you want." David met her hard gaze. "I just figured since I'm already wet you would want me to traipse through the swampy bits." Susan felt a soft blush creep up her neck as she turned to the area he had indicated on the makeshift map. The grass there was reedy, wide, and tall, indicating that the ground was damp. Without another word, she moved forward, making her way to her assigned spot. "Bossy," the young woman mumbled, stopping to look down at the base of a big tree and marking her steps in her mind. It irked her that she had brought his man to the place she had visited so often only to have him think out a practical plan for searching every square inch of the glade. "Anything?" David shouted from the opposite side of the field. "What do you think we're going to find after all these years?" Susan knew her voice was sharp, but she didn't like this development one bit. "I don't know," the young man's voice echoed in the clearing. "A piece of metal, glass, an old bridle." Susan turned glaring at the man. "A bridle? Why would there be a bridle?" She placed her hands on her hips, giving the man her most scathing stare. "Your grandmother said the horse had no halters or anything. Maybe they were tied up and lost them or something." This time Susan did roll her eyes, but she quickly dropped them to where her feet were making soft tracks in the earth. For the next hour, the two people traipsed back and forth across the plot, pausing to compare what they saw and jot notes in the journal. "We haven't found anything," Susan grumbled. "This is a complete waste of time." Her shoes were soggy, her temper rising, and her irritation with the man was a pebble in her shoe. David looked down at his notebook, as shadows began to fall across his face, setting his high cheekbones and square jaw in contrast. "One more place," he mused. "If you'll take that square," he pointed at a block of lines on the page. "I'll take this one." Susan stomped off toward a large old oak tree, mumbling about wasted time under her breath. Walking around the base of the tree, kicking her feet, Susan yelped as her toe connected with a root. "Ouch," she shouted, hopping on one foot. "Are you okay?" David trotted over to where Susan was dancing around on one foot. What happened? Susan stopped, still balancing on one foot. What's that? She dropped to her knees. Look. David squatted next to her, his eyes inquisitive. What is it? Susan dropped her hand to the soft dirt near the root base, flicking away small rocks and earth, to expose a sliver of red. I think it's a tail light, she whispered, lifting one shard to the sun. It's old, whatever it is. This is shatterproof glass, it isn't plastic like we have now. What do you think it came from? I don't even see any roads around here. Things have changed up here. They used to cut timber, and there were probably old logging roads that have grown over now. David smiled, meeting the young woman's gaze. Maybe this is the clue we've been looking for. What are we going to do with it? Is there some way to find out what it came from? I don't know. David opened his journal, making a careful note. I'll check around and do some research. Susan picked up a stick and poked around in the dirt trying to find more pieces, collecting what they could and trying to piece them together. It does look like it was part of a tail light, David nodded. Can I keep this? He turned, offering a smile. I have a friend who works in a garage who might be able to help. Reluctantly Susan nodded. The obnoxious Mr. Watkins had made his point and maybe, just maybe, they were one step closer to solving the mystery. Chapter 3. As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. Proverbs 27 verse 17. The sun was painting the horizon with the last rays of a dying day as Susan pulled up to the big house in her blue Wrangler. David, though chilled, had dried out nicely and was anxious to get to his mechanic friend with their new clues. He had a feeling that this shattered tail light was important, but he couldn't explain why. I'll give you a call tomorrow, he promised, hurrying around the side of the house to his old truck. I know this is important. He patted the cargo pocket of his muddy pants, waving as he hurried away. Susan watched the man jump into his truck and roar out onto the road. He seemed so confident about the find that she couldn't help but hope he was right. Perhaps this was the break they had both been waiting for, and it would lead to the answers no one had ever been able to provide, or it could lead to nothing. Turning, she walked into the house, a brief smile gracing her pretty face. She would wait to tell Graham until they had something more to share, but she knew this was the break she needed to put everything into place. David patted the shards in his pocket, smiling at the solid clue the day had brought. It had been so long since anything had seemed to fall into place or point in a specific direction that he could hardly believe their luck. A bright grin spread across his face as he shifted gears, rolling into the intersection as hope bubbled in his chest. The sound of tearing metal and the impact of a heavy vehicle slamming into the front of the old pickup rattled the young man to the bones. His head bounced off of the T-section behind the door and the world went black. The flash of colored lights flickered into David's brain and then ebbed to darkness once more. The sound of sirens and rending steel rocked through his brain before blissful silence swamped him once more. He was floating, somewhere between reality and dream. His vision flickered like the flashing lights, light dark, red swam before his eyes, his brain filling with images and faces he couldn't place as a final wave of blackness swept over him, dragging him into an ocean of unconsciousness. David opened his eyes to light. A soft bright glow filling the space around him and his head spun, turning his stomach over in its wake. A soft beeping sound behind him pulled him from the darkness that threatened to drag him down once more, and he clung to it as a lifeline. Mr. Watkins? A sharp voice punched into his brain. Mr. Watkins, can you open your eyes? David pushed his lids open again as a stark white room came into focus. You need to wake up, Mr. Watkins. David, call me David. Can you look into the light? The voice echoed again. David squinted as a bright light stabbed behind his eyes. What happened? You were involved in a hit and run. This time David was able to follow the voice back to a woman in blue scrubs who was peering at him intently. I hit someone? No, based on the witnesses, someone ran the light on Big A and took out the whole front of your truck. You're lucky to be alive. David lifted a hand, his whole body crying out in pain. He felt like he had been hit by a Mack truck, and perhaps he had been. My truck, how bad is it? I wouldn't know, but as soon as you're up to it, the police would like to talk to you. Fine. The pounding behind his eyes was growing stronger, and David leaned back against the upright bed, closing his eyes against the pain. I'll talk to them. Not in your condition, the woman's voice echoed again. I'll tell them to come back later. The soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on tile flooring indicated that the doctor was walking away, but David was fading back into the welcome embrace of sleep. The soft glow of the room lights flickered into darkness, but the red glare of a police car still reflected in his mind's eye. He tried to focus, tried to remember what had happened. He had pulled out as the light turned green, never seeing what hit him. The residual flicker of emergency vehicles' bright red glare seemed to have been imprinted on his eyelids, and only the welcome embrace of sleep washed it away. David's eyes shot open again, and he sat upright, fighting the growing nausea in his stomach as he looked for his clothes. Where was the clue? Where were the few precious shards he had procured on the mountain only hours ago? Head still spinning, he struggled to focus until he found the call button, pressing it as his head fell back against the bed. You should be asleep, a nurse hurried into the room. I know Dr. Ames gave you something for the pain. Where are my clothes? David choked. I need my pants. You are in no condition to go anywhere, young man, the portly woman in the pink and black striped scrubs chided. I just need to see them, David said, his words slurring. Please. All right, the nurse responded. But they are very dirty. She handed the mud-splattered chinos into his hand and his fingers crushed into the pocket. Thank you, he said, as the world turned to black once more. He needed to get this clue somewhere and soon, but first, he would close his eyes against the pounding in his head. When the staccato drumbeat ended, he would remember what to do. Chapter 4. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. Proverbs 17 verse 17. I'm sorry, I don't understand. Susan pressed her phone to her ear as she carried coffee and muffins into the old house. Why are you contacting me about a hit and run? We understand you were the last one to see Mr. Watkins before the accident, and we wanted to touch base and see if you can shed any light on the situation. The man's voice on the other end of the line drawled, as Susan clamped the phone between shoulder and ear, opening the door of her family's home. Are you saying that Mr. Watkins hit another car or something? Susan was struggling to understand why the police were calling her about the man's accident. No, the man's voice was short. Do you know if Mr. Watkins had been drinking? No, he most certainly was not. He left here, and if the time you told me is right, he hadn't been gone more than a few minutes before he was in an accident. A cold shiver raced down her back as she considered the situation. Something wasn't right here. Did you find a journal in his truck? As far as I know, all of his personal belongings are still in the truck. A long pause told Susan that something more needed to be said, and she waited, placing the 2 large lattes on the table and adjusting her phone. Miss Holmes, do you know of anyone who might want to hurt Mr. Watkins? Susan stood staring out the window of the breakfast nook, her eye glazed as she felt the weight of the words. Miss Holmes, are you still there? Yes. I mean no. I don't know. Mr. Watkins and I were in the mountains yesterday looking for clues to his grandfather's disappearance. We thought we might have found something, but this doesn't make sense. What doesn't make sense? Alana Holmes walked into the capacious kitchen, snatching a coffee with a grin. Covering the phone with her hand, Susan turned to her grandmother. Mr. Watkins was in an accident last night. She held up a finger as the officer on the other end of the line spoke once more. Did you find anything? Susan glanced at her grandmother, who was busy peeling the plastic lid off her cup and pouring the contents into a large mug. No, she lied. We didn't find anything. I told him there wouldn't be anything up there after all these years. I was just humoring him. He seemed very upset. Thank you, the officer's voice was calm. I'll let you know if there are any further developments. As the phone went dead, Susan sagged into the nearest chair. Had someone tried to kill the man she was helping? What's wrong? Graham took a seat across from her, flinching when Susan sipped from the large paper cup. Mr. Watkins was hit by another car last night on his way home. It sounds like a hit and run, but the man I spoke to wanted to know if anyone might want to hurt David. They think it was intentional? Apparently. Graham looked down into her mug, then back up at her granddaughter. What do you think it means? I think it means someone doesn't want us to discover what happened to Harcourt Watkins all those years ago. What will you do? Alana leaned toward Susan. Maybe you should go see your young man and make sure he's all right. He is not my young man, Susan snipped. I'm simply trying to solve this mystery, and he might be able to help. You should still go see him. Alana touched at her hair in annoyance. What if someone thinks he knows something, or what if he knows something, but doesn't know he knows it? Susan felt a headache behind her eyes and sagged, taking a large gulp of her coffee and reaching for a banana muffin. I'll go. After all, he's the one who has those bits of glass we found on the site. He was very methodical about searching the area. Graham stood, walking to the tall bank of glass-fronted cabinets that made up the butler's pantry, taking down a small gold-framed photo. Who would have believed that finding 2 lost horses in the national forest all those years ago could cause so much trouble? She smiled, looking down at the bay paint horse in the picture. He was a sweet little terror, that horse. If only he had been able to speak, none of this would be necessary. Susan rose from the table, walking to her grandmother and wrapping an arm around the trim woman's waist. We'll figure it out, Graham. We'll know why those horses were left to fend for themselves, and how they connect to the disappearance of old Mr. Watkins. You just be careful, Graham said, pulling her sweet little Susan into her arms. I don't know what I'd do if something happened to you. Nothing is going to happen to me, Susan assured. I'm sure this accident is simply some drunk driver who fled the scene. It probably has nothing to do with what David and I were doing yesterday. The words felt hollow on her lips even as Susan spoke them. There was more to this age-old mystery than she had ever believed, and she needed to see Mr. Watkins. She needed to make sure his journal and the bright shards of glass were safe. They were the only clue they had to go on, and she wasn't letting them slip by. Slowly slipping back into her seat at the small oak table, Susan smiled. Come finish your breakfast, Graham, she insisted. I didn't go all the way to the bakery for nothing, you know. You might have, Alana grumbled, picking up the oversized muffin and examining it. I'm not sure this second generation of bakers is as good as the first. That bakery has been a part of this town for as long as I remember, and I do hate to see it fading away. Susan's chuckle was full of cheer as she watched her grandmother nibble the pecan pumpkin muffin. Perhaps the old-timers who used to run the bakery had retired, but the food was still good. Knock, knock. Susan tried to infuse her voice with a wealth of cheer. I brought gifts. She pushed into the hospital room where David sat upright in a hospital bed, his emergency-issued gown far less faded than the tan on his face. Gifts? David spoke through the dull thud in his brain. Gifts. Susan's smile was bright as she lifted a paper cup in one hand and an orange cranberry muffin in the other. Thank you, David groaned as his mouth began to water. That is the best bakery in town. In town? Susan teased, holding the items away from him. Don't you mean in the world? I haven't been out in the world. The corners of David's mouth turned up in a grin. I just know that anything beats hospital food, and that bakery has the best of everything. Good enough. Susan placed the muffin and coffee on the table across the man's lap. He looked pale, and a dark bruise showed along the side of his face. Thanks. David's eyes were pinched with pain and Susan's heart squeezed. How bad is it? She pointed to the bandage on his cheek. I have a concussion, a small cut by my eye, and a roaring headache. This should help though. He lifted his cup, taking a long sip of the hot brew, then scowled. Milk? I didn't know how you took it, so I just had them make my favorite. David grinned. It will do, but I usually drink it black. I knew there was something wrong with you from the moment we met, Susan laughed, her voice soft. No one in their right mind drinks coffee black. David chuckled, flinching as the sound echoed in his hollow brain. I'm glad you're here, he managed, closing his eyes for a moment as he rested his head against the upright bed. If you'll grab my pants, he pointed toward the chair beside the bed. I'll write down the address of my friend, and you can take that glass we found to him. We need to find out what kind of car it is from. You still have it? Susan hurried to the chinos draped over the chair. Why wouldn't I? David bit into the moist muffin, sighing with pleasure at the warm rich punch of orange and the tart tang of cranberry. Susan looked up, meeting the man's soft brown eyes. I got a call from a police officer today. He asked if I knew anyone who would want to hurt you. Me? Why? Susan peeled back the flap of the cargo pocket and pulled the bits of red glass out, opening her hand where they sparkled in the morning sun. You can't think that someone would try to kill me for those. David shook his head, and then stopped as a wave of pain slammed into his skull. Besides, he said more quietly, we were the only two people up there. None of this makes sense. Susan slipped the shards into her handbag, turning to the window to study the parked cars below. I've been trying to figure out how those horses ended up on the mountain all those years ago, and you have been trying to uncover what happened to your grandfather. Why would someone suddenly be worried about us continuing the investigation? David opened his eyes, his gaze colliding with Susan's bright blue orbs. We must be missing something, he suggested. Between us, there must be something that will point us to the answers we both so desperately seek. But what? Susan could feel the frustration spark in her words. I've been over and over the story 1,000 times. I need my journal. David pushed himself up in the bed, turning to look at Susan. It's in my truck. Do you think you could get it? Where's your truck? I think it's at the police impound lot. Susan pulled her phone from her pocket and searched for the number. Write me a note, so I can go in and get your belongings. Is there anything else you need? Not really. David's head was pounding again. Bring the journal back, and we'll go through it together. He hated asking for help, but he knew there was no way around it. Do you have paper and a pencil? Together, they scanned the room looking for something to write with, but saw nothing. We'll ask at the nurse's station. David threw back the covers, slipping out of bed on bright yellow socks. I'm sure they will have something, and one of them can witness the signing, so you won't have any trouble at the station. Susan bit her bottom lip, trying not to laugh as the man tottered toward the door, his yellow socks, looking like duck feet, but what really made her laugh was the four-leaf clover boxer shorts peeking out between the loosely tied flaps of the hospital gown. Hurrying to keep up and trying her hardest not to laugh, Susan couldn't help but notice the man had very nice legs, and a rather cute tush, not that she was looking, of course. A moment later, they stood at the counter where a pretty young nurse in a floral print uniform handed them a pen and paper. David wrote a hasty note and then handed it to Susan to read before asking the nurse to witness it. That should do, he said. Bring the journal back as soon as you can. He leaned heavily against the counter, his head spinning. We'll go through every entry until something pops out at us. Susan nodded, her eyes still bright with unshed mirth. See you soon, she grinned, hurrying toward the elevator. David watched the young woman hasten away, wondering what she was grinning about. This whole situation had suddenly gotten far too serious. Can I help you back to your room? The nurse asked, walking around the counter and stepping up to David. Oh, and you might want me to tie this, she added, tugging his gown together. David's face flamed as he peered down the hall, catching Susan Holmes' peals of laughter as she disappeared into the elevator. Susan followed the uniformed police officer around the side of the building, and through a small gate that led into the impound yard. Is that it? She gasped, looking at the mangled remains of the old truck. Your boyfriend was mighty lucky, the officer drawled. It could have been much worse. Oh, he's not my boyfriend. Susan felt the blush, but still couldn't comprehend the mess she was looking at. The driver's side of the truck had taken the major impact, moving the whole front axle over at least 6 inches. Either way, he's lucky. Just holler when you're done. The large man waved, heading back into the air-conditioned building. Susan headed to the passenger side of the truck and yanked the door open, crawling in among the shattered glass and torn metal. The journal wasn't on the seat, so she began going over the truck inch by inch. She had looked under the seat for the 3rd time, peered behind the headrests, checked the glove box, and even looked under the brake pedal, but there was no sign of the journal anywhere. It has to be here somewhere, she growled, nibbling her lip. I'm sure he had it when he left Graham's. You all right, lady? A man in greasy overalls walked toward her. You've been looking in there a long time. Has anyone else been through this wreck? Susan asked, backing out of the truck. Nope, it came in last night, and you're the first person to check on it. Shame about the truck, it's not an antique, but it's a classic just the same. Are you sure no one has been in here? Yep, I signed it in myself last night, and I came in first thing this morning. What are you looking for anyway? A book, well, a journal really. Susan placed a hand on her hip and gazed around her. I know David had it with him when he left my grandmother's yesterday. You could ask the EMTs, the mechanic said. Maybe they picked it up, or maybe it fell out when they were moving your friend. How can I get a hold of him? Susan turned, her blue eyes inquisitive. Let me check the books. The man disappeared back into the garage, returning with a clipboard full of pink and yellow slips. Here you go, he said, pointing at a sheet. These are the guys who picked up the driver. They should still be on shift at the fire station if you hurry. Thank you, Susan grinned, taking note of the names. I'll head over to the fire station and see if they are available. Good luck, the mechanic called after her as she retraced her steps through the police station and back to her car. What do you mean you couldn't find it? David felt his mouth go dry as chills raced down his spine. It was in the truck with me. I know, Susan could see the anxiety on David's face and her heart clenched at the despair in his eyes. I looked everywhere. I went over every single inch of that truck, but it wasn't there. Maybe it fell out when they picked it up. Did you call the tow truck driver? The police who interviewed me last night didn't mention it. I called everyone. Susan walked toward the hospital bed where the young man sat, his hands clenched. I tracked down the EMTs, the tow driver, the police on the scene, everyone. One of the officers said he thought he saw something on the floor when they cut you out of the truck, but in all the confusion he doesn't know what could have happened to it. Did you search the area? David pushed himself out of his bed, bending to grab his mud-splattered chino. We'll go there now, he insisted as the room spun. Susan bolted across the room, grabbing the man by the shoulders and pushing him back onto the bed before he toppled. His arms were tight, roped with hard muscle, and warmth radiated from him, washing over her like heat waves dancing on the pavement. You aren't up to going anywhere. Susan's voice was sharp as she guided him back to his bed. You don't understand, David hissed through clenched teeth. Everything I've collected over all the years is in that book. Every tiny detail, news clipping, interview, everything. Susan's heart sank as she listened to the man's anguished voice. We'll find it, she assured, feeling none of the confidence she tried to force into her tone. We'll figure it out. David opened his eyes, meeting Susan's blue gaze, and the room finally stilled. His head was pounding, but it was nothing compared to the pain in his heart. He couldn't fail now. He had to find the truth. He had promised his grandmother he would uncover the facts. Did you talk to all the officers? David finally managed to squeak. Susan released the man's shoulders, pulling her phone from her pocket and tapped the screen to see her notes. It wasn't easy, she admitted. Everyone is working, and finding them in one place was almost impossible. There were 2 officers at the accident, and then the EMTs arrived and brought you here. The tow driver arrived while both of the policemen were still there, taking reports from any witnesses. There were witnesses? David sat up again, his eyes full of hope. Not really, Susan hated the way the man slumped back into the bed. They mostly arrived afterward. It was a quiet day, and that street isn't busy at the best of times. Silence filled the room as Susan scrolled through the notes she had taken, searching for anything that might lift David Watkins from the depths of despair. What if you tell me everything you remember from the notebook? She lifted her eyes, meeting his dark caramel gaze once more. Maybe I'll catch something? David sighed, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. He had collected every scrap of evidence, rumor, or titter in that journal. Surely he could remember most of what it held. Chapter 5. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Hebrews 10 verses 24 to 25. Susan stood from the uncomfortable chair next to David's bed, stretching her back. She had been typing notes hunched over her phone for what seemed like hours. "I'm going to get some coffee," she smiled. "Want some?" "Sure." David's lunch sat on his table almost untouched. "I hope they let me out of here soon. I'd like to go back to the scene of the accident." "I'm sure it was just that, probably a drunk driver who fled, but maybe we'll see something." Susan knew that he was hoping to find his journal somewhere in the area, but something told her it wasn't there. There was far more to the missing journal, if only she could figure it out. What if someone was trying to take you out? She nibbled her lower lip, not willing to meet the man's eyes. What if you were getting too close to the truth? "Surely anyone who was involved in my grandfather's disappearance is long gone," David insisted. "It was more than 50 years ago." "What do you think happened?" Susan looked up, falling into the warm rich brown of David's eyes. "I don't know," he admitted. "All I know is that the godly woman he was married to would never have put up with a grubby, lawless moonshiner as a husband." The conviction in the young man's eyes struck deep into Susan's heart, like an arrow hitting its mark, and she nodded, something intangible putting truth to his words. "As soon as I get us some coffee, you are going to tell me everything you ever found from the beginning, every thought, suspicion, or inkling you have ever had." The sun was turning the blue of day to the purple haze of night when a doctor in a white coat stepped into the room. "We're letting you go," the tall man grinned, shifting a hard candy from one side of his mouth to the other. "You need to take it easy for a few days, and if your headaches get worse, get checked out." The man's dark eyes twinkled under wire-rimmed glasses, and a cheerful spirit seemed to emanate from him. "It would be best if you weren't alone for a day or two," he grinned again. "Maybe stay with a friend." His eyes met Susan's as he gave her a wink. Susan choked back a laugh at the wink the doctor shot her, waited until he had answered David's questions, before she spoke. "I don't even know how I'm going to get home," David sighed, eyeing his clothing stacked neatly on the nightstand beside his bed. "Why don't you come and stay with me and Graham for a couple of days?" Susan suggested. "It's just the two of us in that big old house anyway, while Mom and Dad are doing a train tour of Alaska. We can go over the case and see what we are missing." "I'll be fine." David refused to meet her eyes as she reached for his clothing, handing it to him. "I'm used to being on my own." "Maybe you are, but you have a concussion, and if someone did try to take you out, how are you supposed to look after yourself?" Susan's blue eyes flashed as she glared at the stubborn man. "What can it hurt for you to stay with us for a day or two? Who knows, maybe we'll find your journal. At least I can drive you around until you get some wheels." David felt his resolve melt under the weight of her logic, and he nodded. Okay. He waved her back to the chair. "Can I at least get dressed in peace?" A bright giggle bubbled from Susan's lips as she remembered his cute green and white shamrock shorts, but she quickly hurried from the room as the dividing curtain zipped shut. "Where do you live?" Susan asked as she zipped out of the college entrance that was shared by the hospital. "We can run over there and grab some clean clothes, or whatever you need, and then I'm taking you for dinner." "I'm starving." As if to punctuate her current state of hunger, her stomach rumbled and David laughed. "I could eat," the young man grinned. "What they served me today doesn't fit my idea of grub." "How about food first?" He looked down at his rumpled clothing and cringed. "Unless you're ashamed to be seen with me." "Food works." Again Susan's stomach growled, protesting the demise of the single muffin and bland coffee she had as her only sustenance for the day. "How long have you been working on this mystery?" Susan asked as she sank her teeth into a humongous burger a half-hour later. "You certainly remember a lot of what was in that journal." David shook his head, dipping a fry into ketchup and lifting it toward his mouth. He wasn't sure if it was the fresh air of a Georgia evening or the company, but his head was already feeling better. "Since I was about 9, he answered, shoving the fry into his mouth and savoring the salty crunch. "My grandmother would talk about Pap, and nothing she said matched with the man who had disappeared without a trace. The police insisted he was an old bootlegger bandit, but Grandma spoke of a man who feared God, taught his children to work hard, and treated her with loving kindness." He waved Susan to silence as he continued, seeing the protest in her eyes. I know, there are books filled with cases of men who deceived their families, but something never seemed to click. The young man grinned as he lifted his burger and met Susan's eyes. I guess I picked up the thread and grew a little obsessed. I lost my mother when I was 6, so Grandma Watkins helped raise me. She was the best. Honest, loving, kind. No matter what anyone said about Pap, she never believed it. She was steadfast in her love for him even after he was gone. David's eyes grew soft as he smiled. She loved him and believed he never would have left her. She really loved him? She did. David took a bite of his burger, letting the juices pool in his mouth as his eyes closed in bliss. He hadn't realized how hungry he was, and now that he wasn't feeling seasick, he was enjoying his food. Do you have anything else at your place that might shed light on this whole mess? We can pick that up when we swing by your place. Tomorrow, we'll try to piece everything together. Something tells me that we are very close to an answer. David walked down the hall toward his tiny apartment, Susan on his heels. It won't take me long to get everything I need, he called over his shoulder. His stomach was gently chiding him for his large dinner, but he pushed the feeling to the back of his mind. Susan gazed around her at the old apartment building on Main. She had driven past it her entire life, but being inside it was a whole different story. Generations of college students had resided here, and though newly renovated, the place still had that old 1920s feel. The Alexander had started life as a hotel and was popular with soldiers during training at Kahi Mountain. After a fire in the 1950s, it had been restored and became a perfect location for off-campus student housing. Huh? She huffed, walking into Mr. Watkins' outstretched arm. What? Shoo, the man whispered, looking down at the door before him, which stood slightly ajar. Someone's been here. Susan reached into the waistband of her jeans, and then shoved past David, pushing the door wide. What in the world are you doing with that? David's eyes were huge as he noted the tiny pistol in the woman's beautifully manicured hands. I always carry this, she smiled, gazing around her for any indication of an intruder. Oh no, David groaned. Someone has tossed the place. Susan sighed, making her way into the two-room flat. It looks like they are long gone. Slowly she slipped the little gun back into its holster at the small of her back and began scanning the overturned apartment. Clothing, dishes, and papers were scattered everywhere. Do you need to sit down? She asked, turning and taking in the ashen face of her companion. No, David shook his head. It just feels so wrong. Susan wrapped her arm in his, feeling the shiver run down his torso. Come on, let's get your things and get out of here. Shouldn't we call the police? I guess so, Susan agreed, biting her bottom lip. Something David was coming to understand indicated worry. What if they come back? David Watkins. A shrill voice echoed down the hall, followed by a portly woman in a bright pink house dress. What on earth is going on here? I heard the worst racket earlier. Don't make me report you for having a loud party. Everything's fine, Mrs. Dodds, David ducked into the hall. Nothing to worry about. I just had a little accident is all. He tapped the spot on his head where the large bruise stood out bright against his pale skin. Who's that with you? The woman poked her head into the apartment, her fuzzy curlers peeking out from under a silk scarf. Oh, a girl. The older woman grinned. It's about time, she added, but don't you think you should have cleaned up before entertaining? Young men these days, she waved, turning and heading back the way she had come with a shake of her head. You two keep the noise down now. Laugh that crept into her throat but only succeeded in turning it into a snort. Oh, my, she gasped, turning bright red as she covered her mouth with her hands. Do you still want to call the police? No, I'm tired. I'll get my things, and we can go. His voice sounded so weary and defeated that Susan barely resisted the urge to pull him into a hug. A few moments later, he stood at the door, a gym bag in one hand and a small metal box in the other. Pictures, he said sadly as he followed Susan back down the hall to her Jeep. At least they didn't take these. Susan Holmes was seething. She was so angry she could have spit, an expression that had never made any sense to her before this moment. Someone was targeting David Watkins for his investigation, and it convinced her, more than ever, that they were onto something. The question was, what? She had doubted his insistence that his grandfather had been more than an old reprobate moonshiner. Everyone in the city had heard the rumors for years about old Harcourt Watkins and his moonshine still, but now she had her doubts. There was more to this cold case than either she or David had ever realized, and she was more determined than ever to solve it. Susan's very own grandmother had reported seeing the old man walking through the college, shotgun in hand. Now, she wasn't so sure. She couldn't believe that a feud over rot-gut liquor would have led to someone stalking David all these years later. They were missing something. Something important was just there out of reach, but they would track it down. Determination cemented in her soul, and Susan wouldn't let it go until she had all of the answers. "Susan, is that you?" Graham called from the living room where she was watching reruns of her favorite show, Matlock. "Did you eat?" "Hi Graham," Susan called, dragging David with her. "I brought a friend." David turned, taking in the lovely profile of the woman next to him. Friend, the word echoed in his brain, smoothing over the constant drumming that had plagued him all day. Friend? "Well, we know you aren't the enemy." Susan smiled. "David is going to stay with us for a few days," she continued, walking over and placing a kiss on her grandmother's cheek. "He had an accident last night, and the doctor doesn't want him to be alone." "Put him in the blue room," Graham grinned. "It will be nice to have a man around the house again, even for a bit." "Thank you," David sighed. He was tired, shaken, and worried, but determined to see this through to the end. David dropped headfirst into the large mahogany bed, sinking into the soft mattress with a welcome sigh. His head was spinning, and the dull ache that had been there all day threatened to grow into a crescendo of epic proportions. So much had happened in the past 24 hours that he couldn't begin to put all the pieces together. He had confronted a family who had looked at his ancestor askew for eons, had been nearly killed by a crazy driver, lost his life's work, and found his apartment ransacked. None of it made sense even as it pointed towards some sinister plot. Rolling onto his back, David stared up at the antique four-poster in the elegant room. Pushing himself to the edge of the bed, he stripped out of his dirty clothing and headed for the bathroom that made up the ensuite of his room. A hot shower and a good night's sleep would go a long way to clearing his head. Flipping on a light, David Watkins studied the bathroom with wide eyes. This whole house was far beyond anything he had ever been in. Elegant only began to touch the well-appointed realms of each room. The bathroom adjoining his room was picked out in blues and whites, with masculine sailboat print wallpaper that set him at ease. A huge clawfoot tub that looked like it had been conjured from a bygone age sat on a white tile floor facing a clear glass-enclosed shower at the end of the room. Overall, the old-fashioned, high-end space fit the house perfectly, and though everything was modern, it looked like it belonged in the old Victorian home. Moments later, the hot water pounding on his shoulders began to soak away the fear, doubts, and worries of an exceptionally long day. Chapter 6. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. Luke 6 verse 31. Susan yawned, padding across the floor to the coffee maker and pushing buttons until a dark brew began to pour into the largest mug she could find. She had been up late into the night, her mind turning over the events of the past 2 days. All she had wanted was to understand where the 2 horses her grandmother had rescued had come from, but now something darker and more dangerous filled the horizon like a wild summer storm. "You have another one of those?" David Watkins sauntered into the kitchen in a pair of dark blue jeans and a plaid button-up. "I could use about twice that much." Susan chuckled, rising and opening a cupboard door. "I got the biggest mug," she teased, pushing buttons again and waiting for the hot black brew to fill an only slightly smaller mug. "Graham claims she hates these things, but I see her using them sometimes." David took the mug from her hand, touching his lips to the rim as his eyes met hers. "Ah, I may survive after all. How's the head?" Susan gestured to the table, inviting the young man to join her. "Not bad," David replied, touching gingerly at his face. "How's it look?" "Not bad," Susan's voice was hushed as she studied his handsome face. He was a very attractive man, even with the dark bruise coloring his cheek. "Breakfast? Are you cooking?" Graham walked into the kitchen, neatly dressed in a pale blue t-shirt dress, every hair in place. "That will be a treat," the old woman smiled. "Don't let her fool you, she can cook. She just doesn't do it often. She's always too busy." "Graham," Susan shook her head but grinned. "I'll throw together a couple of omelets." "Anything you don't eat?" Her blue eyes turned to David's, and a soft shiver ran through her as his eyes met hers. "Nope, I'm not picky. I eat almost anything, even my own cooking." "So what are you two young people doing today?" Graham pushed her empty plate away a short time later. "Any clues you need to track down?" "I don't know," Susan replied, turning to look at David. "Do you want to go back to your place and have a look around?" "I probably should," the young man admitted. "We should have called the police last night, but I just couldn't deal with it." "We'll head over there now." Susan stood taking the plates and heading for the dishwasher. "If you still want to call the police or make a report, we can do it then. I'll have dinner ready at 6 tonight." Graham grinned. "We'll expect you to stay at least one more night while all this gets sorted out." "That isn't necessary," David began, only to stop at the hard look in the old woman's eyes. "Yes, ma'am," he hastened. "That's better," Mrs. Holmes smiled. "I knew you were a good Georgia boy at heart. Is she always like that?" David asked as he climbed into the vibrant blue Jeep. "I think your grandmother scared me as much as finding my apartment ransacked." Susan laughed. "Graham doesn't insist on much," she said, roaring out onto the main road. "When she does, though, everyone listens." David grinned, grabbing the hold bar as the young woman whipped the vehicle around a turn. "Is she a good cook?" "The best." Susan's bright grin and shining eyes did more to convince him of the truth than her words. "I don't know if I said it earlier or not, but thanks." David watched the familiar landscape zoom by. "I'm not sure how this whole thing is going to go, but something tells me that we are getting closer to the answers we have both been seeking than we ever have been before. I only hope that is a good thing." Susan pulled into a parking spot in front of the old Alexander and shoved the Jeep into park. "I'm starting to think that someone doesn't want us to know the truth about what happened to your grandfather." "Do you still have your little friend?" David asked, nodding toward her waistband. "Always." "You must be David," a tall man with a round face and round belly called, striding down the hall toward the pair as they entered the old building. "I've been looking everywhere for you." "I've been away," David hedged, cutting his eyes toward Susan. "I was in an accident." "You aren't injured, are you?" the older man asked, a look of concern skidding across his face. "Perhaps we should talk later." "Who are you?" Susan stepped up next to David, her elbow all but brushing his as she stared at the large older man. "Why do you want to see Mr. Watkins?" A warm chuckle rolled off the big man's chest, like honey from the comb. "I'm Andrew Codens. I was the detective assigned to Mr. Watkins' case all those years ago." "Oh." Susan felt herself relax at the man's smile. He had a way of setting a body at ease. "What do you want with David then?" "I heard you were poking around into your grandfather's disappearance." Again the bright smile appeared as rich hazel eyes sparkled. "I'm afraid my curiosity got the better of me. I'm retired now, but having to leave that case unsolved always rankled." "I can understand that," David agreed, fidgeting with the keys in his pocket. "It seems someone else has been curious as well." He nodded toward the door of his apartment. "Last night when we came back here to get my things, we discovered someone had broken in and ransacked the place." "Really?" The old man's hand twitched as if reaching for a revolver. "Was anything taken?" "Have you reported it to the police?" Susan felt her cheeks burn as together she and David shook their heads. "I'm afraid that with everything that happened, we just moved past it." "Would you like me to have a look around?" The man's warm eyes and cheerful face put them both at ease, and David nodded, slipping the key in the lock and opening the door to the mess they had abandoned the day before. "Someone made a mess," the older man said, his eyes flicking across the room as he searched out every corner. "Did they find what they were looking for?" "I don't know what they were looking for," David admitted. His head was starting to pound again and he wanted nothing more than to grab a coffee and sit on his overturned couch. "Was there something else you wanted?" David finally asked. "I'm afraid my headache is returning." He pointed to the bruise on the side of his face, "and all I want to do is put this place back together." "No, no." The old man's eyes roamed the room once more. "Just let me know if you find anything interesting." His fingers slipped into the back pocket of his dress pants and he handed David a card. "I sure would like to see this case put to rest. Nothing ever quite stacked up if you ask me." "I know," David sighed, taking the card that Mr. Codins offered. "I'll keep you posted if we discover anything new." "What was your take on the whole thing?" Susan spoke, her voice coming from the tiny kitchen where she was busy picking up a chair. "Did you suspect foul play?" Her comment was directed at the old officer, and he turned, meeting her steady gaze. "Not necessarily," the former officer spoke. "It wasn't uncommon for men to up and disappear even back then. They grew tired of family responsibilities, or found a new woman. Pap would not have left my grandmother." David all but shouted. "I know it." "I'm not saying he did," Mr. Codins raised his hands in a soothing motion. "All I'm saying is that things like that happened. I interviewed his whole family, and I was surprised that they were completely divided by your grandfather's disappearance. Half were convinced he would never leave, and the other half believed he was a no-good bootlegger." David walked to the table, dropping into the now upright chair. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his light brown eyes. "I don't think we'll ever find the truth," he groaned, placing his arms on the tabletop and buried his head on them. "Buck up, son," the retired officer grinned. "Maybe this is just the break you have been looking for. Someone doesn't like what you're doing, or this wouldn't have happened." He turned slowly in a circle amidst the mess, stopping to pin Susan with intelligent eyes. "Just be careful you don't bite off more than you can chew." Susan studied the older man for a moment, then turned toward David slumped at the table. Her newfound friend had been through the mill in the past 48 hours. He had nearly been killed in a car accident, his home had been turned over, and his journal with all the years of hard work was missing. "Thank you," Susan said, walking toward the table. "I promise we won't. If this gets too dangerous, we'll back away." Impulsively, she rested a hand on David's shoulder. "Even a mystery like this isn't worth someone getting hurt." "Right you are." Mr. Codins nodded. "You're a sensible young woman, and Mr. Watkins is lucky to have you in his life." He laid a finger alongside his nose, giving Susan a wink. "Just keep me in the loop if anything juicy turns up. It would be a win to know what really happened all those years ago." Susan watched as the man showed himself to the door, closing it quietly behind him as she looked down at her deflated companion. "I'll make us some coffee," she said, turning to look at the rifled room. "You just sit." David's wry chuckle caught Susan by surprise. Who would have believed that a Holmes would be serving a Watkins coffee in the old Alexander apartments? His short bark of laughter made Susan grin, and in moments all the tension and angst of the last few days seemed to whisk away on the wind, leaving in its place a staid friendship full of hope, promise, and a hint of danger. "Would you mind taking me to the impound yard?" David asked as he walked into the kitchen of the beautiful Victorian home the next morning. "I'd like to look at the damage to the truck and make arrangements." Susan was sure he wanted to look one more time for his journal as well, but she didn't mention it. "Sure, anything else you need to do? We can drop by your place if you need anything there." David struggled to repress the shimmy that rolled over him when he thought of someone else rifling through his belongings. He and Susan Holmes had put the place back together the day before, but the feeling of vulnerability was hitting him hard on this cloudy day. He was even more grateful for Susan and her grandmother for letting him stay with them. It was still early as the pair sat down to French toast and bacon, prepared by Susan, at the small breakfast nook. The informal setting seemed to fit their mood, and soon they were chatting about their childhood and life as a whole. "So you have always wanted to know why those 2 horses were left up on the mountain?" David asked as he pushed his breakfast plate away. "Yes," Susan smiled. "I was always pestering Graham to tell me the story. I had a hard time believing she and Gary hadn't walked off with someone's prized ponies, but no one ever claimed them. As far as I know, my family never had any horses like those. An old uncle had a brown pony he used to plow his summer garden, but the rest of us had cars. The man's bright grin was contagious, and soon Susan was laughing. And here I thought all you Watkins were still riding mules to town. David grinned, surprising himself. He had come from nothing and felt it for most of his life. His family had worked for every little thing they had. No, we have been driving since the Model T arrived in them there hills. His eyes sparkled as he realized that though Susan had been born to wealth, she was very much like him underneath it all. Susan spluttered on her coffee at the man's dry wit. You could kill a body that way, she grumbled, her blue eyes bright. Does your family still own the old homestead? She added, suddenly curious about David Watkins and his life outside what she knew. Yes, my father actually has the place, and we still put in a garden each year. Pop is retired and is visiting some old friends up in Tennessee right now. For a moment David's shoulders sagged. He shook his head, dreading the fight with the insurance company this week. I don't know what I'm going to do about the truck, he finally spoke. I have one more semester of college to complete before I'm done, and I was planning on keeping that old clunker on the road until I had a good job. I hadn't thought of that. Susan's smile turned into a frown. Are you missing classes with all of this now? No, I have a couple of weeks off until the next round start. I'm doing as many online classes as I can, and I already called my boss at the steakhouse from the hospital. He understands that I'll be out until the doctor clears me. You know you're welcome here as long as you need to stay, right? Susan reached across the table, covering David's hand with hers. And don't worry about the truck too much. I'm sure it will work out. David looked up, offering a soft smile. Of course, a Holmes would think that everything would turn out right. All you had to do was throw a little money at a problem and poof, it was gone. A subtle silence filled the space between them as Susan withdrew her hand. Somewhere between the moments, he walked through her grandmother's door, and when she carried him a creamy coffee at the hospital, she had started to like David Watkins. The wild Watkins had a reputation for some shady business in the past, but this man was a straight arrow all the way through. Should we go? She asked, standing and taking the dishes to the dishwasher. Maybe you can find something I missed at the impound lot. David felt his lips twitch at Susan's words. Apparently, she had seen through his suggestion to have a look at the truck. Still, he was grateful to have someone willing to help him, not only get around town but to solve the mystery that had for so long plagued his family. Perhaps at first, he had resented the nosy woman butting in on his case, but now he was thinking that two heads truly could be better than one. Chapter 7. Many a man proclaims his own steadfast love, but a faithful man who can find? Proverbs 20 verse 6. The bright blue Jeep trundled from the driveway of the big old house, an easy target to trace as it sped down the dirt drive and onto the main road. So far the two amateur sleuths didn't seem to have any real inkling of what had happened in the mountains all those years ago, but careful watching was needed to ensure they never did. One insignificant man's disappearance, long ago, was only the tip of the iceberg in this tale, and two meddling kids wouldn't prove an obstacle for someone who had come so far. Aiming one large hand in the direction of the speeding Jeep, the watcher cocked a thumb, pulling an imaginary trigger. Only time would tell if the young people in the blue Jeep would become a problem that needed to be dealt with. In the meantime, watching them chase their tails was rather amusing. You look terrible, Susan said an hour later as she and David walked back to the Jeep. The man beside her looked completely dejected as he slouched toward her ride. I know what will cheer you up. Susan tried to fill her voice with joy she didn't feel. Lunch at my favorite restaurant. David flicked his eyes toward the young woman at his side, catching the strained smile on her face. You don't need to take me to lunch, he drawled. No, but I do have to feed my face. Susan's giggle was real this time as she beeped the Jeep engine to life. Come on, you might even like it. David slipped into the Wrangler, pulling his seatbelt into place, and sighed. He couldn't imagine where Susan Holmes would want to go for lunch. There weren't that many places in town to dine, and nothing high-end enough to warrant the label favorite. I know you're disappointed about not finding the journal, Susan spoke as she sped toward Big A Street, zipping through every green light as they beckoned her toward the middle of town. I was half hoping you would find the journal, even though I would have had to throw a fit for not finding it myself. David felt his lips twitch and a light chuckle break from his chest. Susan pulled the Jeep to the right, bumping over the entrance of the drive and pulled to a stop. Come on, if you're nice, I might even buy you ice cream. This is your favorite restaurant? Yes. Do you have a problem with it? No, David spluttered, climbing out of the Jeep. I'm just surprised. Susan shook her head, giving the man a dirty look. Well, if you don't like DQ, you can wait here. David hurried to catch up, still chuckling. Can I have a peanut butter parfait? His spirits lifted as he teased. Only if you eat all of your lunch. Susan shot him a harsh look, then fell into peals of laughter. At least she had managed to lift his spirits after the demolition of his truck and the confirmation that his journal of evidence was nowhere to be seen. I still can't believe that of all the places in town you chose lunch here. David smiled, looking down at his empty burger wrapper as he dug into the towering pillar of ice cream, peanuts, and hot chocolate topped with an extra portion of whipped cream. Susan rolled her baby blues, but smiled. Just because my family has been here forever, and just because we made out well with my great-granddaddy's peach farm, doesn't mean we are snobs. I like burgers and fries as much as anyone else, and you've been at the house long enough to know we are perfectly normal people. I'm not sure about the normal part of that. David's grin was wicked as he studied the pretty young woman's face. Susan grabbed her rolled-up straw paper, flicking it at the man and laughing as it pinged off his nose. I am normal, she grinned. David laughed, the feeling of despair evaporating in the brightening sun. Thank you, he whispered, his dark eyes serious. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come to see me at the hospital. I can't even get myself home right now. Susan shook her head, sticking her bright red spoon upright in her peanut butter cup blizzard. I'm sure you would have figured out something, she replied. You seem to be a rather resourceful person. David shook his head, feeling his face flush. No, I'm not, really. I'm not afraid of hard work, but I've never been good at making connections and keeping up with friends. I think my obsession with Grandpa Watkins' disappearance put people off. It doesn't put me off. Susan looked up, meeting his light brown gaze. You have already helped me find more clues in the past 2 days than I have in 2 years. We are very close to real answers. She leaned across the table, her expression intense. I can feel it. David didn't know what to say, so remained quiet, waiting to see what else Susan might say. Look, tomorrow is Sunday. Why don't you come to church with me and Graham, and then we'll hike up to the Little Falls in the afternoon. We'll just relax and let all the information and facts percolate into our brains. Maybe by Monday, we'll have some idea about what to do next. David felt himself nodding his head, wondering what he was agreeing to. A warm rush of emotion seemed to flood him as Susan spoke, and a feeling he was completely unprepared for washed over him. Was he starting to like the spoiled little rich girl he had never really known? Could a few days in Miss Holmes's presence have this odd effect on him? Somewhere between an oversized ice cream and an overturned truck, something had happened to him to change his attitude toward the whole Holmes family. Instead of a nosy, overbearing brat, he was discovering a hardworking, determined woman with a good head on her shoulders, and the courage to press forward on a case that might never come to an end. Susan felt the eyes of the congregation on her as she stood next to David Watkins. He looked handsome in a dark blue suit and red striped tie, with his sandy hair neatly brushed into a side part. Susan had never been one to bring a young man to church before, but by the way her grandmother was beaming, you would have thought she had won a great prize. As they finished the third song from the old hymnals, a tiny shiver raced down Susan's spine, and she turned, trying to figure out who was watching her. The notion flickered through her mind and she pushed it away. Everyone she knew was looking at her, and she was torn between enjoying the admiration having a handsome man next to her brought, and a feeling of dread at not only the assumptions other parishioners might have, but the potential of an assailant lurking somewhere in their midst. Are you all right? David asked, leaning down at Susan's worried look. It's nothing, she said, forcing a smile as her mind turned over a new thought. If old Mr. Watkins had been murdered all those years ago, could the killer still be alive? If so, had they been living right here in this little town in the northern hills of Georgia all this time? Susan looked between her grandmother and the young man at her side, suddenly understanding how dangerous her simple decision to find out where two stray horses had come from really was. It was even possible that the person responsible for the mysterious disappearance of an old-fashioned moonshiner was singing hymns in this hallowed space. "We'll talk after the service," Susan finally hissed. Nodding and smiling at the curious faces around her. "You have been very quiet," David said as they trudged up the rugged trail toward a favorite hangout of generations of students at the school. "Is something wrong?" "I'm just thinking." Susan paused, turning to look back down the trail. It wasn't a difficult trail, but it wasn't kept up and there were muddy spots where water seeped from the earth. David stepped up next to Susan, turning and looking back down the trail. "You're worried?" "A little. It kind of sank in during church that whatever happened to your grandfather might still have an impact on someone who lives right here in our hometown. I just can't seem to make the connection." David sighed, feeling the warmth of the sun dappling through the thick canopy of leaves. "If I had my journal, maybe we would see something I've been missing all this time. Surely there must be something in all those clippings, reports, and interviews that would point us in the right direction." Susan shook her head. David was an intelligent and able investigator. If he hadn't put the pieces together from everything in the book, she didn't see how she would. "Come on," she smiled. "I want to stick my feet in the water and forget about all of this for a little while. Today we are just two friends out for a walk." David grinned, turning to fall into step with Susan once more. "Do you come up here often?" "Not as much as I would like. This past year was grueling with dual enrollment in 2 different colleges and 2 different majors." She laughed lightly. "Maybe I chose the wrong courses, and I should have studied investigation." David's bright laugh was like a cool breeze, and Susan's spirits lifted as she forced thoughts of a missing moonshiner and 2 wild horses from her mind. A few minutes later, the soft roar of water over rocks hastened their steps, and soon, they were both ankle-deep in the cool water of the mountain stream. "That feels wonderful," Susan said, bracing her hands on the rock where she sat, her face turned to the sun. David splashed his toes, splattering her ankles with icy droplets. "Hey," Susan griped, kicking her feet, "you'll get me all wet." A hard kick splashed water over both of them and she squealed when David crashed his foot into the shimmering depths. Water glinted in the bright sun as they both began to kick and splash, twisting and scattering water everywhere. Susan turned, dipping her hands into the racing stream and lifting a huge scoop of water at her companion, only to slip forward with a scream. David lunged, trying to grab Susan before she fell, face forward into the babbling brook, his hand finding purchase on her wrist, but the woman's forward momentum was too much for even his strength to offset, and they tumbled into the shallow water with a geyser splash. Pushing upright into the water, David flicked his hair from his eyes, turning to see a spluttering Susan struggle to push her lush locks from her face. A laugh trickled from his lips, and David reached out, pushing a strand of dripping hair from Susan's eyes as they both burst into peals of mirth. They were soaking wet, spluttering, and tangled in a heap of bare feet and legs. Susan's eyes sparkled brighter than sunlight on the water, and David found himself falling once more. His smile slipped as he dipped his head toward hers, brushing sweet lips with a simple kiss. Susan sank into the kiss, feeling warmth fill her even as the cold water gurgled around her. David's lips were soft and inviting as she closed her eyes, drinking in the taste of him. The sound of noisy teenagers ascending the path made David jump back, plopping into the pool as he forced his eyes away from Susan. He hadn't meant to kiss her, but one thing had led to another. "We'd better get back." Susan pushed herself to her feet, slogging out of the shallow pool without a backward glance. "Gram will wonder what happened to us." The hike back to the base of the trail was filled with an awkward silence as both parties dripped their way back to the jeep. "What else do you have at your place related to the case?" Susan asked as she turned the key and pulled away from the pretty campus and the brick buildings scattered among the gentle hills. "What?" David pulled his mind away from the kiss, relieved that Susan had decided to concentrate on the work instead of what had happened in the pool above the hills. "Nothing really." He gazed out at the passing landscape full of trees and flood plain. "I kept everything in the journal." "What about that box you brought with you from your apartment? What's in that?" "Mostly old photos." I didn't like the idea of leaving them behind in case someone came back. Can I see them? Susan glanced toward David, whose face was in profile. Sure, he replied, keeping his eyes on the road. He didn't want to meet her blue gaze again, for fear of losing himself in their warm depths. In a matter of minutes, Susan was pulling into her space at the back of the large, elegant house. Something smells good, she grinned, traipsing onto the back porch and pushing through the screen door. Graham, we're back. Supper won't be ready for another hour, Graham said, walking out of the kitchen. My goodness, what happened to you? Susan's bright titter of laughter made David grin, but he shook his head, racing for the stairs and dry clothes. He would leave Susan to deal with her grandmother. We fell in, Susan's voice echoed along the hall as David took the stairs 2 at a time, wondering if she would tell her grandmother everything. We're going to look at old photos in the office as soon as I get changed. David grinned, catching the last words, before turning down the hall toward his room. Who's this? Susan asked, pointing at another black and white photo of a couple dressed in 40s garb. That's Grandma and Grandpa Watkins, David replied. Susan was hovering at his shoulder, and her steady presence seemed to fill the room. You look like him, Susan straightened, lifting the picture and looking back and forth between David and the snapshot. He certainly doesn't look like an old reprobate here. Thanks, David snatched the photo from her fingers, studying his grandparents. He had loved his grandmother, and no matter how often family or friends would criticize her mate, she had always defended Harcourt. You never would have believed from this photo that one day he would just be gone. I'm sorry you never knew him, Susan said. It doesn't seem fair. If I could just find out what happened. David ran his hands through his hair as his mind spun. Here's another shot of your grandfather. Who is the man with him? Susan lifted another photo of 2 men standing shoulder to shoulder in an open field. I have no idea, David said, taking the small photo and turning it in his hands. It looks like there was something written here, but now I can't tell. Susan opened a drawer on the desk, pulling out a tiny ink roller used for making hand-printed greeting cards. Let me see, maybe we can pick it out with this. Turning the photo over, the young woman ran the ink roller over the faded words, watching as they darkened, coming into stark contrast against the yellowed paper. Sheriff Drew Fraser, David read, turning to look at Susan. Why would my grandfather be with the sheriff if he was running moonshine like all the reports said? It doesn't make sense, Susan scowled. They look like they might even be friends. I think a trip to the records office is in order tomorrow, David mused. Maybe we can find out about this Fraser fellow and learn why he would be in a photo with my grandfather. It doesn't make any sense, Susan agreed, nibbling a pretty nail. Did your grandmother ever say anything about the sheriff? No. Never. David turned back to the photo, studying the 2 men. His grandfather was slightly built, while the sheriff was tall, broad, and serious. See if you can find any more photos of them together. For the next half hour, the 2 of them scanned every photo in the box, but never found another picture of the 2 men together. By the time Graham called them to dinner, they were both plotting their day in the town archives. They needed to find out everything they possibly could about Sheriff Fraser and his relationship with Harcourt Watkins. Where had the 2 men been when the photo was taken? How did they know each other? What was their relationship? More spinning between them now than there had been at the beginning of the day, but something told Susan she was on the right track. Chapter 8. Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and, if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And above all these put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. Colossians 3 verses 12 to 14. There are loads of articles here on Fraser. Susan hurried through the basement of the old courthouse, carrying a case full of newspapers. He seems to have decided he would clean up some of the problems with the old moonshiners in the hills back then. He certainly campaigned on that platform, David agreed. Look at all of these old stickers and signs. He scrolled through the microfiche, highlighting old slogans. If Grandpa Watkins was a moonshiner, why would he have befriended a man set on pulling down the whole industry in these hills? Do you think there was any money to be made in selling corn whiskey? Susan couldn't place what was troubling her, but there was something wrong about the picture. This county was still dry back then, David spoke. It's only been the past 20 years or so that restaurants have been allowed to serve alcohol, so I guess there was probably a pretty good demand. I hadn't thought about that. Susan rifled through the papers searching for any more clues. Maybe your grandfather was trying to convince Fraser to let well enough alone, and they became friends. Maybe, David shook his head, but Grandma Watkins always insisted that Pap would never make or sell illicit hooch. Besides, if it was such a good business, why didn't they ever have money? Susan paced the small room in the dark recesses of the courthouse. Nothing made sense. It was possible that David and his grandmother, before him, were just unwilling to accept the truth that old man Watkins had been a moonshiner. Do you think anyone would have killed someone over whiskey rights? I mean, there was plenty of room up there in the woods, and fresh water was never an issue. Moonshiners could surely have come to some agreement, perhaps each choosing a different area in the county to sell their wares. Your grandmother said she had seen moonshine makers traipsing through campus when she was a student. Back then you weren't allowed in the hills for fear of being shot. They didn't carry those shotguns for nothing. Susan looked up, worrying her bottom lip between her teeth. But to kill someone over a few bottles of rotgut doesn't make sense. It wouldn't be worth the risk to kill your competition when you could simply pack up and move somewhere else. You're right, there has to be something more. David watched as Susan pinched her bottom lip between her teeth, trying not to remember the warm silky feel of it pressed against his own. What would be worth that risk then? His eyes never left her mouth. Something more important than a still and corn liquor. Something more important than the few dollars a man would make from selling a half a dozen gallons of moonshine. What if Harcourt stumbled across something else? What if someone was doing more than just selling moonshine? Susan looked up, meeting David's eyes. Like what? I don't know. David pushed himself from his chair, taking the 2 steps between them in a single stride. We don't have much to go on, but look at what we know. Susan looked up expectantly, not sure if she was waiting for him to continue or wishing for him to lean down and kiss her again. We know that Pap was in those hills. The young man ticked his first point off of a finger. We know that he met with Sheriff Fraser at least on one occasion. He held up another finger. We know that my grandmother never believed the rumors that he was making and selling moonshine. A third finger came into play. What does it all mean? Susan's eyes grew wide as she puzzled out the questions. David, her voice was breathy, and she rested her hand on his arm. If your grandfather was working for Sheriff Fraser to identify the moonshiners, maybe one of them did shoot him. David shook his head. I still think they would have just left. They could just as easily have moved to another location and snuck the hooch back into this county from anywhere. Susan nodded. It had to be bigger stakes than just selling whiskey then. Her hand still rested on his forearm and she could feel the ripple of muscles under her palm. Oh my goodness, she gasped. David, we've been looking at this all wrong. Your grandfather wasn't making moonshine, he was trying to find out how it was still getting sold when the sheriff of the county had all but declared war on those who manufactured it. How many arrests were made of people transporting the stuff? David asked, his voice going hoarse. How many actual arrests were made? This is a small county, there can't have been that many men assigned to the case. If Grandpa had discovered that one of them was working with the moonshiners, that would be a reason to kill. Susan's blue eyes were huge as she met David's gaze. It wasn't about the moonshine, it was about finding out who was letting the moonshiners function right beneath the sheriff's nose. A cold shiver raced down David's back as the pieces clicked into place. Did you ever take those shards of glass to my friend at the local garage? Yes, but I haven't followed up yet. I think he might have the final piece of the puzzle. Come on, Susan said, grabbing her purse and heading for the stairs. If you're thinking what I'm thinking, this isn't over yet. A man's legacy, reputation, and community standing might be in play here. David slipped his hand into Susan's as they raced up the stairs and out of the building, dashing for the jeep and hopefully the last answers they needed. If his friend could identify the car that those broken shards had come from, they may have the last shred of evidence to prove their theory. Now if they could only identify who might have gone so far as to murder a man who was tasked with ferreting out who was behind keeping an age-old activity alive. Kick back! David practically shouted as the wind roared past his ears. Someone was getting a cut of the profit. Are you sure you'll be all right? Susan asked, peering out of the Jeep as she dropped David off at his apartment the next day. I'll be fine. My head is good. I'll see my doctor tomorrow, and I have to get back to work. Give me a call if you need anything. Susan found herself reluctant to say goodbye to the man she had spent so much time with recently. David's warm chuckle drifted back into the Jeep. I will, he smiled. You be careful and let me know if you find out anything new. Promise, Susan agreed, crossing her heart as he closed the door. She would head to the courthouse again, following a new path she hadn't thought of before. If it paid off, she would let David know, and together they could follow the trail to the truth. A short trip through town and a trip to the archives had Susan squinting at old newspapers trying to make out the names, dates, and pictures of an array of people who were active investigators at the time of Mr. Watkins's disappearance. David's friend had narrowed down the broken taillight to a few possibilities, and Susan hoped that with a little work they could match the car to the killer. She would gather information on the men involved first, then head for the driver's registration office to see if they would let her compare notes. Pulling her phone out of her pocket, Susan began snapping pictures of men who were loosely connected with the war on moonshine, lawlessness, and graft. As she studied each image, carefully reading the names in tiny printed captions and making notes, a pattern began to emerge. A thrill of excitement poured through her as she started to put more pieces together. If what she suspected were true, the connection between the horses her grandmother had rescued and the disappearance of Harcourt Watkins was more sinister than she would like to admit. Switching off the brightly lit magnifying glass, Susan slipped the notes into her bag and turned to go, gasping as a dark shadow loomed over her. Fancy meeting you here, Mr. Coden smiled at her. The bulky man dwarfed her, making her cringe at his sheer size. Though old, the man was tall, broad, and thick, appearing to be strong and intimidating, despite the bright smile on his face. I was just leaving, Susan smiled, backing into the chair she had just pushed under a desk. What are you doing here? I come down and go over old cases now and then, the old man smiled. You look like you have been busy. He nodded his gray head at her bag. I'm just making notes. Care to share? The old man grinned again, easing his stance so one leg was slightly bent. It's nothing at the moment, Susan hedged. None of it makes any sense. There doesn't seem to be any connection between Mr. Watkins and the horses my grandmother found. That always baffled me, Mr. Coden said. There must be some connection, but it never showed up. I always hated leaving that case unsolved. Maybe if we had known what happened to Harcourt, it would have been better, but we didn't have a body or any evidence of foul play. I think that is what David is hoping for. He just needs to know. Susan felt a bead of sweat trickle down her spine. She desperately wanted to leave. She wanted to talk to David Watkins and share her new insights. The thread she had tracked down was thin, but it was all they had. Did Mr. Codens know more than he was telling? Was he involved in old Mr. Watkins' disappearance? I hope you'll call me if you learn anything new, the old man said, stepping aside. Let me know if I can help. Thanks, Susan replied quickly, dodging through the space the man had made. We'll call you if we learn anything. Susan's heart was still pounding as she slipped into her Jeep, moments before the heavens opened and rain began to pound on the vinyl roof. Hands still shaking, she pulled the careful notes out of her bag, running a finger down the list. Mr. Coden's name loomed large among several others who would have known Harcourt Watkins. Whatever had happened to David's grandfather, it was evident that the men on this list had known he would be in those hills. They had to know what he was doing up there. Susan squeezed her lower lip between her teeth. If a bad cop had been caught by Mr. Watkins with his hand in the moonshine cookie jar, would it be enough to lead to murder? Susan dragged a ragged breath into her lungs, trying to still her jangled nerves. If someone had silenced the old man, would they be willing to do it again? With a sudden wave of fear spreading from head to toe, Susan revved the engine, slamming the Jeep into gear and racing back the way she had come. David could be in danger. When he had first had the accident, Susan was sure that it was just a coincidence that his journal had gone missing. Now she was positive that there was something in that book that would pinpoint the person who had silenced his grandfather forever. "Please let him be all right," Susan pleaded, as she screeched into a parking space and dashed into the rain headed for David's apartment. "David! David!" she shouted, racing down the hall. "David!" David stepped into the hall, a dish rag in his hand as Susan came barreling toward him, throwing herself into his arms. "What's wrong? What happened?" He pulled her close, shocked by her panic. "You're okay." Susan pulled back, looking up to meet his warm brown eyes. "I was worried." "I'm fine." David wrapped an arm around her, pulling her into the apartment as other doors began to pop open. "Come inside before we get another visit from my nosy neighbor." Susan wrapped an arm around David's waist, feeling the warmth and strength of him. "Mr. Codins was at the archives," Susan sighed as David sat her in a chair at the table, turning to put the kettle on. "Tell me what happened." Chapter 9. Or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? Luke 15 verse 8. Susan watched David as he made coffee for the two of them, clamping her hands on her lap to keep from reaching for him again. She was being ridiculous, letting fear get the best of her. "I'm sorry," she finally managed as David sat a steaming mug in front of her. "I don't know why I was so frightened. I must have let my imagination get the best of me." "It's better to be safe than sorry," David spoke as he took a seat. "Something must have happened to ruffle you so badly. Besides, sometimes those feelings are God trying to warn you about something." Susan gaped for several seconds before she felt her soul melt. She had been thinking the same thing, but trying to second-guess everything was turning her inside out. "Susan, I'm fine." David reached across the table, wrapping his hand around hers. "Now tell me what you found in the archives." Susan felt the tension ebb from her shoulders as David's hand rested on hers, and her heart slowed its frantic beating. "I feel silly," she said, feeling her face heat. "I'll show you what I found." David withdrew his hand as Susan turned to get her bag. "It must be good." "It's a little frightening." Susan turned back, placing her notes on the table, then pulling her phone out and opening the gallery. "I was going through the police records and rolls, matching up names that appeared over and over in the investigation of your grandfather's disappearance. Mr. Coton's name seemed to be everywhere. He was the investigating officer, of course his name is on everything. But what if it was him? Look," Susan pushed her notebook closer. "Officer Codins was part of the task force that was trying to bring the moonshiners to heel. He had loads of arrests. See?" She pointed at the list of names. "This is the chief, he's the man in the picture with your grandfather, but their names were never linked in any of the articles." David stood walking around the table to lean over Susan's shoulder as she lifted her phone, flipping through the pictures she had taken. "Here are the 4 men who worked the hills, trying to clear out the moonshiners. Codins arrested your grandfather in '65. He must have been trying to get your grandfather to split his profits with him. Maybe Harcourt threatened to tell the chief." She flipped back to the picture of David's grandfather and the man who had been in charge of the task force. But Grandpa wasn't a moonshiner. David's stubborn statement made Susan shake her head. Then why was he arrested? And released? They can't have had anything on him. David tapped the notes where the charges had been dropped. Who were these other men? He peered at Susan's phone and the 4 men she had indicated earlier. Amesbury, Jim Johnson, Dan Wellings, and of course Andrew Codins. They were all in the task force. "We need to talk to the other men." David took a turn around his small kitchen. "Maybe they'll have some suspicion about what happened." "We don't know who we can trust," Susan said, shaking her head. "We need to be careful. If Codins is the dirty cop, we don't want to tip him off." "We'll be careful," David agreed. "Don't worry. For now, I have to go to work. Can you dig into where the rest of these men are now?" For all we know, they're not even alive. I'll do some searches today. Why don't you come over for dinner tonight, and we'll see what I come up with? Susan's blue eyes sparked with hope. She didn't want to leave David on his own for some reason. She liked having him around. Having someone to talk to about all the strange questions bouncing around in her head. I'll see you there, the young man smiled. Now go home and stop worrying. Susan collected her notes, stuffing them into her bag. Be good. She shot over her shoulder as she headed out the door, feeling far better than she had before. Hey, what's for dinner? David shouted as the door swung shut. Susan was feeling much better as she drove the short trip home, calling out to her grandmother as she entered the house. You're home sooner than I expected. Alana walked into the kitchen, examining her granddaughter critically. I found some information. Tea, Graham stated. Sit while I get it. I made shortbread. We can munch while you talk. Oh, David is coming for supper, Susan said, taking a seat and pulling out her notes. This time as she looked at them, more questions stirred in her brain. I only have a salad for supper. Alana glared at her granddaughter. I'll order pizza. Susan's absent reply made Alana grin. Oh, I love pizza. Can we get some of those little hot wings too? Susan's chuckle was kind. Her grandmother never ceased to amaze her. In a matter of minutes, Alana and Susan had their heads together studying the notes and pictures. This man looks familiar. Graham tapped the screen indicating Mr. Codins. I think he might have spoken to me after I found the horses. I know an officer came out to look at them, but they didn't know who owned them. It's all such a mess, Graham. Susan looked up. David and I have a theory though. A theory? That sounds serious. We think one of the policemen was involved in the moonshining and was getting a cut of the profits. Back then the county was dry and men could make some ready cash selling hooch. A poor farmer could be sure to make enough to pay taxes and hold on until the harvest came in with this nefarious pastime. Susan, the way you talk. Susan grinned. Her grandmother was old school and never had a hair out of place. You don't really believe that a police officer was involved in all of this, do you? Graham asked as she lifted a crisp shortbread wedge. This is such an old case. Are you sure it is worth the fuss? David thinks so. Susan turned serious eyes on her grandmother. It must be terrible to live with everyone thinking that your grandfather either ran off on his family or worse was killed in some drunken brawl. Well, you two need to be careful. People who have worked so hard to keep a secret will not like you trying to dig them up now. Susan smiled. She had been thinking the same thing, and though she wanted to find the truth and solve the mystery of the painted ponies, she didn't want to see anyone hurt. If I think there is any real danger, I'll stop. Susan grasped her grandmother's hands. You're a good girl, Graham said. Now where are we going to get pizza tonight? Susan's chuckle washed away the last of the residual anxiety from earlier that day. Perhaps tonight they would do something fun and not fuss over faded papers and old pictures. It would be good for everyone to put some distance between themselves and the case. There were so many questions, suspicions, and odd threads that the whole thing was going to drive her crazy. A night off and a nice chat might be just what they all needed. Despite her best intentions, Susan and David spent most of dinner talking about the clues and ideas they had come up with until Alana told them to put the notes away and pulled out an Uno deck. You two young people have gone over all of that at least 3 times. Give your brain a rest and do something fun. She turned soft blue eyes to David and smiled. We can all get to know each other a little better. David, tell us about growing up in town. David smiled, shifting his eyes to Susan as she shuffled the deck. What would you like to know? Oh, I don't know, Graham started. How about your girlfriend? Surely a handsome young man like you has a girlfriend. Susan had to bite back a laugh at her grandmother's question. The woman was shameless, but she realized that she wanted to know if David had a girlfriend as well. The memory of that brief kiss at the Little Falls made her stomach tremble, and she paused in her deal, losing track of her card count. I'm sorry, she smiled at David, collecting the cards and starting again. I lost count. Alana Holmes shook her head. Pay better attention. David, you were about to tell us if you have a girlfriend. David felt his face flush as he flicked his eyes to Susan once more. I haven't had time to think about a girlfriend, he finally admitted. I have to finish my last set of classes before I can think of anything else. Then there's the whole mystery. Susan felt the air fill her lungs once more as she started to breathe once more. The kiss was a simple mistake that could have happened to anyone. So why was she so happy to know that David Watkins was unattached? Susan yawned, covering her mouth as her eyes grew heavy. She couldn't believe it was after midnight already. After dinner, and a few rounds of Uno, her grandmother had headed for bed, leaving Susan and David to talk about the mystery they were both determined to solve. Soon, they were discussing life, childhood, and their educational and life goals, leaving Susan feeling even more drawn to the young man. We have a lot in common, David said, his eyes twinkling as he covered his own yawn. We grew up on different sides of the tracks, so to speak, he gestured at the large home, but our beliefs and determination are the same. I think if people would stop looking at everyone's differences and focus on what they had in common, our world would be a far lovelier place. Susan smiled, seeing that David agreed. Growing up I heard whispers about the Watkins and the reputation of how they had earned their living walking a fine line on the law. Now I realize that you were raised with the same deep-rooted respect, love, and devotion I was. The greatest commonality is Christ, David said. My grandmother was a believer and taught me to understand God's love, forgiveness, and grace. I don't understand why people fight so hard against God's gift. The young man shook his head. They seem to think that if they surrender they are giving up all the fun, control, or dreams they ever had, but in reality, they gain a peace that passes all understanding. Love, Susan's single word echoed in the quiet kitchen. Love binds all of mankind together, but first you have to give up the selfishness, greed, and relentless drive for power. Surrendering to God's love and peace gives more freedom than anyone can imagine. David felt his heart turn over in his chest. He had only known this young woman for a short time, but he was drawn to her, and his heart sang with joy that she understood surrender, love, and peace as he did. Still, he was only a Watkins, and she was a Holmes. The family in the big house that gave to charity, donated to churches, and had everything. When you first walked in the door of this house, I was determined not to like you. Susan looked up into David's eyes. No, I wasn't being a snob, no matter what people say about my family, I just didn't want to share my mystery with you. David's warm chuckle rolled over Susan, sending a shiver down her spine. She was getting tired and sappy and needed to say goodnight before she did something stupid. I'm glad you have changed your mind. David pushed himself out of his chair, leaning forward and placing a sweet kiss on Susan's forehead. I'm headed home now. You need to get some sleep. I'll give you a lift. Susan stood hurrying around the table. No, I texted for a driver a few minutes ago and they're outside now. He studied Susan, longing to pull her in for a goodnight kiss. I'll check in with you tomorrow. Susan followed David to the front door, waving him down the stairs to the waiting car that shimmered in the soft glow of the porch light. For several seconds she stood there, outlined in the door as the car pulled away, feeling cheated that she hadn't been kissed in the dim golden glow. Shaking her head, Susan pushed the door closed, turning the deadbolt and flicking off the light. She had to be even more exhausted than she had thought to think such a crazy thing. Dragging herself up the stairs to her room, she couldn't help but smile though. She liked David Watkins, and she knew that together they would solve the mystery of the painted ponies and the missing grandpa. Chapter 10. The mystery hidden for ages and generations, but now revealed to his saints. To them God chose to make known how great among the Gentiles are the riches of the glory of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. Colossians 1 verses 26 to 27. Most of the week had gone by before David was able to contact Susan again. Every hour he had been away from the young woman, he had wanted to see her face, touch her hand, and talk to her. She was so much more than he would have expected, and being with her was so wonderful that he feared he was falling in love. David? Susan's voice was animated as it zinged through the other end of the line. I was starting to get worried. I tried your phone a couple of times, but you don't have voicemail set up. I've been busy at work, David explained, thrilled that she had missed him. One of our other servers is out sick, so we have all had to take on extra hours. My new classes have started as well, and I had to get things set up. He paused, wanting to say so much more, but still fearful of the reception. I've missed talking to you, he finally blurted. I've missed you too, Susan's reply made him smile. So what's up? Any luck on the auto records? David asked. He was starting to think that was a long shot at best and that their first real clue was leading to nothing. No, I can't find anything substantial. There were loads of cars that used that glass. I'm afraid I'm not finding anything. Would you be willing to go back up to the cabin with me? David held his breath, worried Susan would say no. Yes, of course. What have you discovered? Nothing, but I have an idea, and I think I'll need your help to test it. I'll be right over. Susan hung up the phone so fast that David stared at it in his hand for several seconds. Shoving the device back into his pocket, he raced to his room to change into his best shirt and get his backpack ready. He didn't know if he was more excited about putting his idea to the test or seeing Susan. Either way, it was a win-win situation. Double-checking his pack, David caught himself humming and then began to laugh. He liked Susan Holmes, and no matter what the past differences and reputations of their families, he was determined to pursue the new relationship and see where it led. He would tell Susan he liked her and that he wanted to start dating. He had never understood this hedging around one's feelings. If you were going to go out with someone, wasn't the idea to find out if you were compatible? The idea of dating was to determine if there was a future, so he would tell her how he felt and go from there. If she didn't feel the same way, he would know sooner rather than later and could put an end to the whole thing. The sound of the Jeep pulling into a spot at the front of the apartment building had David racing down the stairs, his eyes dazzled by the bright sun and the radiant smile on Susan's face. You look a lot more ready for a hike today, Susan grinned. Did you bring waterproof gear this time? David chuckled, tossing his bag into the back of the Jeep and feeling the Georgia heat already baking his face. That depends. Do you intend to toss me into the creek? Susan revved the engine, pulling into traffic and making the quick loop around the block before heading back the way she had come. Only if you get hot-headed and do something stupid. The smile on the lovely young woman's face took any bite from her words as she flipped the thick ponytail over her shoulder and away from her face. I'll try not to. David's voice was whisked away on the wind, but he was sure he had been heard. So what are we headed to the cabin for? Susan asked. We didn't find anything there last time. I was thinking over this theory you had on kickback and someone putting pressure on the moonshiners to share profits. What if Grandpa had been working for the sheriff to identify who was doing that? I think if he was trying to ferret out corruption in the police force or something like that, he could have been a target of that person's rage. Susan shook her head, concentrating on the winding road up the mountain, as her ponytail of soft brown hair swished. That would be dangerous work. It makes sense. David turned halfway toward her. Grandma Watkins was certain that her husband would never make and sell moonshine, even though the family had a long history of such things. It wasn't until a year or two before Harcourt disappeared that he even went into the woods. Maybe the picture of my grandfather with the police commissioner was taken because they were friends and Pap was working for him. A cloud of dust kicked up behind the electric blue Jeep as they made their way over the side road into the forest, aiming for the small tributary that led to the larger stream. That fits, Susan agreed, slowing as she made the final turn. But what do you think you can find at the cabin? You've been here dozens of times. I started thinking about it, David said as they rolled to a stop under a grove of thick pines. If Pap was collecting evidence, he wouldn't have wanted it to be readily available or obvious to anyone who might show up at the cabin. We know Codens arrested him once on suspicion of moonshining. If I were Harcourt, I would have kept my evidence hidden. He couldn't trust anyone involved in the cleanup operation other than the sheriff. The cabin is too simple to have anywhere much to hide things. You've seen it, just a collection of old logs, a dirt floor, and a sod roof. So where do you think he could have hidden something? Susan hopped out of the driver's seat, reaching behind her to grab her backpack and gear. that's why I brought you along. I figured two of us might be able to figure it out. You have only been to the cabin once and fresh eyes might make all the difference. Susan smiled, filled with delight at the confidence David had in her. I'll do my best. The hike to the cabin was uneventful, and soon the duo was searching every part of the cabin for a hiding place. The floor, hard-packed over years of use and neglected, offered little hope, so Susan and David examined each log with bright flashlights from their bags. Starting at the doorway, Susan worked left, while David moved to the right, both squinting, poking, and prodding the age-darkened logs. It wasn't much of a cabin, was it? Susan asked as she passed the corner. So far every log was as solid and dense as the other. There were no signs of any form of alteration to the wood, and not even the joined corners offered any hint of a place for safekeeping. I think it had been in the family for a long time, David called back. He had reached the single window in the dark little hut and was peering under the faded wooden sill. If I remember correctly, the original Watkins started right here in this little house. Do you think you could ever live in a cabin like this? Susan turned, meeting his eyes, across the room. Even with modern conveniences, it is tiny. I'd like to think I could. David grinned, looking around him. My apartment isn't that much bigger anyway. Susan's laughter seemed to make the dank cabin brighter, and for a moment David suspected he could live anywhere if she was by his side. A hot flush raced up his neck, and he quickly turned back to the window. Now was not the time to tell her how he felt. They were hunting for a clue, not making goo-goo eyes at each other. Silence settled into the space once more as they both resumed the search, hoping to finally find the one thing that could lead them to the answers they both sought. Susan's eyes were focused on every chink, knot, and scratch of the log she examined, but her mind and heart were focused on the man behind her. She liked David Watkins as far more than a friend, but would the man, so touchy about his heritage, be willing to consider going out with a Holmes? For too long people had looked at each other across fences where the grass was not always greener. Hard work, honesty, and devotion meant so much more than a fancy house or a fat bank account. David was hardworking, determined, and devoted to truth. She respected that about him, and could no longer deny the attraction she felt each time she looked into his handsome face. A smile played around Susan's lips as she thought of their adventures so far, and suddenly the revelation of where Graham's lost horses had come from didn't seem as important as it had a few short weeks ago. The fact that this mystery had brought her the friendship of David Watkins was so much more. Pausing in her search, she thanked God for his mysterious ways. Making her way along the back wall, Susan's concentration returned, fully, to the task. This, the longest uninterrupted wall in the cabin, was full of spots where logs had been expertly joined to form a seamless run. Slowly moving the light over each imperfection of the wall, Susan was soon engrossed in her search, completely unaware of anything else in her surrounding area as deft fingers poked and prodded every minute flaw. Susan yelped as her back collided with something solid, and she spun on the spot only to come face to face with David, who had been making his way toward her. His bright smile washed over her, making her heart thump as their eyes met. Reaching out a steadying hand as David dipped his head toward her, Susan closed her eyes in expectation of the kiss. A soft click and gentle hiss made both of them pull back, turning to where Susan's left hand rested on a small chink in the wall. "You found it," David's voice was a whisper. "Something is in there," Susan agreed, turning her light on the tiny crack that had suddenly been revealed. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears, partly in anticipation, partly in disappointment. David pulled his pack from his shoulders, rummaging in its depths until he pulled out a long, tightly sheathed knife. "I'll see if I can pry it open." Inch by inch, Susan watched as the tiny compartment opened a little more with each crank of the knife. Even now she wasn't sure if she would have seen the seams of the hidden compartment, so well joined were the hiding place. "I think there are papers in there." David gently pushed the knife in, prying against the log above. "See if you can reach them?" Susan didn't hesitate, her fingers wiggling into the tight spot and grasping the edge of a tightly bound book. "I don't have enough room to pull it out." "Can you open the front a little more?" "Watch your fingers," David agreed, wedging the knife a little deeper and giving a tug. The little door popped open in a shower of dust, and Susan pulled the journal from its ancient resting place. What is it? David asked, flicking his light toward the bundle. I think it's a journal. Susan opened the faded book carefully, trying to keep the old pages from crumbling. Look, there's a name. David squinted, looking down at the little book. Harcourt Watkins. The words were etched out in a fine script. I think we found what we were looking for. The loud, metallic click of a revolver's hammer made both of them freeze as their blood ran cold. Hand that over real easy, a craggy voice said. No need to turn around. Give me the book and you can go on your way. David's eyes flickered to Susan's, and he could read the fear in their blue depths. Ever so slightly, he nodded, indicating that she should hand the journal to the unseen man behind them. He could see the play of emotion on the young woman's face, doubt, fear, regret, but she was more important than a long-forgotten mystery. Slowly, her eyes still fixed on David, Susan extended the hand holding the faded journal. It was so wrong to have to do this, to let the man behind them win again. The book was jerked from her hand and Susan staggered as in the blink of an eye David turned, lunging for their invisible assailant. The gun fired, Susan screamed, the world spun, and everything went black. The first thing that registered in Susan's brain was pain, not a stabbing sear, but a slow dull thud. Slowly, muffled voices drifted her way, and she opened her eyes into twilight. David, she called, pushing herself upright as memory came flooding back. David. I'm here. The man dashed through the door of the old cabin, kneeling at her side. You're all right, he smiled. You just bumped your head on the log wall when I pushed you out of the way. What happened? Susan shimmied back until her shoulders touched the wall, looking around her until her eyes fell on the heavy raincoat covering her. You're awake, Mr. Coutins called, walking into the cabin, a wide grin on his face. Doesn't look like anyone is going to need an ambulance today. You? Susan's eyes went wide. It was you. No, the old man waved his hands in front of him, brushing aside Susan's accusation. It wasn't Coutins, David affirmed. He showed up after I knocked our gunman to the ground. As a matter of fact, the former detective said, I've been keeping an eye on you two ever since David here had his accident. I told you this whole thing never sat well with me. Something was missing, and I couldn't put my finger on it. So you followed us up here? Susan's brain felt fuzzy, but she tried to focus. I'm sorry, it took me so long to get down the trail, my old knees aren't what they used to be. If I had gotten here a few minutes sooner, I might have caught that miscreant before he accosted either of you. Susan grasped David's hand, pushing the coat from her knees and letting him help her stand. Tell me what happened, she demanded. I seem to have missed all of the most exciting parts. She paused, turning to look into a darkened corner where another man sat tied and gagged, his dark eyes glinting with malice. It's all in the journal, David began. This man wasn't a revenue, but he was taking a cut of the moonshiner's profits in exchange for not bringing them in. The young man paused, listening as new voices echoed down the darkening path. Sounds like we have company, Coutins said. It'll be the welcome committee, he added, turning and heading back outside. Susan shrank in close to David, wondering who else was arriving and if they had more to fear. Our benevolent bodyguard seems to have called the police already. They'll be arriving at any moment. I'm sure they'll want statements. Not before you explain this to me. Susan glared at the man, even while wanting to fall into his arms. This man's name is Clark. He worked for the revenue agency back in the day, but instead of turning moonshiners in, he shook them down for half of their profits. The sheriff for the county had his suspicions, so he approached my grandfather to help him find out who was on the take. With my family's reputation in town, they figured he was the perfect fit for the job. How long have I been out? Susan gaped. Did you read the whole journal while I was senseless? She ran a hand over the bump on the back of her head, scowling at David. David wrapped an arm around Susan, pulling her into his side. No, we, Coutins and I, just scanned the later entries. Clark there started to suspect that someone was hunting him, so he in turn became the hunter. You mean? Susan swallowed hard. He killed your grandfather. She swayed into David's warm embrace, sorrow, fear, and anger mingling in her chest. He hasn't confessed, but I'm pretty sure he did. When he discovered that I was digging into the story and that I had joined up with you, he must have gotten worried. I think he's the one that smashed into my truck as well, David continued. I found this in his pack. David brandished his journal as Codins walked back inside, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers with large, bright flashlights. That's your man, the former detective pointed at Clark, who now huddled into the wall. Are you the 2 who were attacked? One officer asked, breaking away from the trio. I'll need your statements. The other officer moved to the old man huddled on the dirt floor, pulling him upright by one arm and slipping the gag from his mouth. A string of obscenities filled the little cabin as Clark blasted both David and Susan with his ire. You 2 meddling kids, he bellowed. You should have kept your noses out of this mess. The past was dead and buried. It should have stayed that way. What does one grubby moonshiner mean in the grand scheme of things? He was my grandfather, David shot back. He had a wife, a family, a life. Codins patted David on the shoulder. Save your breath, son, he drawled as the officer began reading the other man his rights. It won't do any good. David nodded, pulling Susan closer as he turned his back on the man being led from the cabin. Codins, if you'll accompany me, we'll see this fellow to the car at the head of the trail. The officer added. We'll all go, Susan interjected. I want to see him cuffed and in the car before I go home. David squeezed her shoulders, knowing how badly she wanted answers. Suit yourself, the first officer said as handcuffs clicked into place on the stooped old man. A half hour later, the small group stood at the trailhead, bathed in the red lights of the police car. Susan felt drained and her head buzzed with questions. They had given their statements and watched as the officers prepared to leave. Son, you up to driving to the Holmes house? Mr. Codins slapped a hand on David's shoulder. We can talk this thing through there. Yes, sir. David's answer was brief as he led Susan back to her Jeep, extending his hand for the keys before helping her into the passenger seat. Thank you, Susan said, meeting his eyes as she climbed wearily into the Jeep, buckling her seatbelt. What happened? Alana Holmes opened the door, taking in Susan's ashen face. Mrs. Holmes, Codins called over David's shoulder. If we could come in, we'll explain everything. Alana looked up at the man's face. Aren't you that policeman that came to see me when I first found the horses? She asked, then nodded, pulling the door wide as David and Susan headed for the kitchen. Yes ma'am, Codins grinned, and it looks like I finally got my answers. I'll start the coffee, Alana said. Come on back to the kitchen where we'll be comfortable. Make it strong, Susan said with a half-hearted smile. She sagged into her favorite chair. David, will you please explain? David sat, twining his fingers with Susan's as her grandmother placed cups and cookies on the table as if they were having a friendly visit. I don't really know where to start, he turned, looking at the old detective. I think it is obvious though that my grandfather was murdered by a man named Clark for discovering that Clark, a revenue agent, was shaking down moonshine makers and bypassing the law. Grandpa Watkins was working to find out who was getting kickback for the police commissioner at the time. I'm so sorry, Alana said, placing a pretty coffee set on the table and beginning to pour. I know you were prepared, but it is so sad. All these years, people thought the worst of him, and it turns out that Harcourt Watkins was working for the law. David nodded. There was no arguing the fact that the news was sad, though vindicating. Start from the beginning. Alana's eyes never left David's face as she handed off cups of piping coffee. David sipped his coffee, looking over at Susan, who smiled encouragingly up at him. Yes, everything. The tale was a twisted path of discovery, from what David and Codins had put together from glimpses of the journal. His grandfather had moved into the mountains, trying to determine who had been behind much of the graft of the time. Harcourt had set up a false still only to be arrested by Codins and released later by the sheriff. I always wondered about that, the old detective said. He didn't even spend a night in jail, and I caught him red-handed. Of course, it seems now that he wasn't actually brewing, just setting up to try to catch Clark. So your grandmother was right, Alana said. She knew her husband better than anyone. What sweet devotion over all those years. David cut his eyes toward Susan, wondering if they could build a love like his grandparents had. Why didn't he ever tell her though? Susan asked. They were obviously very close. I think I can answer that, Cotins lifted a finger. If it were me, I would have been quiet to protect those I love. If Clark was willing to kill your grandfather, he wouldn't have hesitated to hurt someone else in the family. How horrid, Alana gasped. But what happened? David shrugged. We don't have all the pieces yet, but it looks like Grandpa found out who Clark was and what he was doing. He came to the old still, or maybe the cabin, and killed Harcourt there. Clark may have been trying to shake down Grandpa for money, or maybe he had figured out that Pap was working for the sheriff. I'm sure we'll find out for sure in time, son. Mr. Cotins turned sad eyes on the young man. I'm just glad you didn't join him. It took a good 5 minutes to calm Susan's grandmother once it came out that Clark had pulled a gun on the two amateur sleuths, assuring her that everyone was fine and that Susan had suffered no more than a bump to the head. But what about the horses? Susan finally asked, trying to distract her grandmother. Where did they come from? One of the entries in the journal stated that Pap had seen the paint in the woods a few times. If I understood it right, he started to suspect that the paint was used to pack kegs from the hills or collect money. You all know how rough those trails could be. The problem was Clark didn't know if Harcourt had told anyone about the horses, so he turned the animal or animals loose, thinking it would die up there. He couldn't take the risk of the horse being traced back to him. So he couldn't claim the horses in case someone put the pieces together and connected the horses to him and then to your grandfather's disappearance? Yes, I still don't know where the colt came from. Maybe there was a mare in the mix and she died, leaving the colt with the horse you named Israel. When we started connecting the dots, that's what panicked Clark. Susan turned, looking at the others. David and I putting our heads together scared him so badly, he rammed David's truck to get his hands on the journal. Only it wasn't the journal we found in the cabin. When I met you, two young people, at the Alexander the First started to worry about you. When I saw the state of your apartment, it put my hackles up. Young folks like you seem to charge right into things without thinking about the consequences. You're lucky I came along when I did. Coden's grin was kind, but his eyes held a serious glint. We are so thankful you did. Susan looked back at David. He had risked his life attacking Mr. Clark. He could have been shot. I'm just thankful that no one was seriously hurt. I wasn't thinking at the time I jumped the old man, David blushed. All I knew was that he had a gun on you, and I couldn't let anything happen to you. Susan felt her face heat and her heart melt. Do you think he would have shot us? She dragged her eyes from David, turning to speak to the retired police officer. After all, I had given him the journal. I don't think he wanted to, Coden smiled. More than anything, he was too old to hide the bodies. Alana gasped, clutching her string of bright pearls. Surely not. The old man shrugged. It doesn't matter now. The man's in jail and we'll soon know the outcome. You two will be called as witnesses, of course, and in time, you'll get your grandfather's journal back. He smiled at David. In the meantime, why don't you make sure this young lady stays out of trouble? You might be amateurs, but you both have a tenacity that a good detective needs. Standing Cotins slipped his long raincoat from Susan's shoulders and nodded, heading for the door. I'll see you at the hearing. I'll see you out, Graham added, jumping to her feet quicker than a woman her age had a right to do as she scurried from the room, leaving David and Susan alone. David leaned over, pressing his lips to Susan's and feeling her tiny gasp of surprise before she leaned in, wrapping her arms around his neck. The kiss was sweet, full of hope and promise, and all of the things he wanted to say and didn't know how. A single kiss. A new beginning. A promise of adventures to come. Epilogue. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. John 15 verse 13. Susan turned in a slow circle, looking down at the gorgeous gown wrapping her in swaths of satin and crepe. It's stunning, Graham, she smiled, looking at her grandmother. Well, of course it is. Susan's mother looked up, dabbing at tears as she gazed at her only daughter. You would make anything look beautiful. October had arrived and the long hot days of summer had faded to the cool rich colors of fall. The mountains, bedecked in their autumn splendor, were a dazzling backdrop of gold and red to her peachy wedding. "You certainly didn't waste any time once you found your young man," Mrs. Holmes grinned. "You rather took your father and me by surprise. All that time at college and no MRS degree. Now, here you are getting married." "Mom," Susan drawled on a giggle. "You love David, so does Daddy." "I know, but a little more time might have been nice." "What's the hurry anyway? David finished his degree and is starting a new job in Athens. Besides, what's the point of waiting when you know someone is right for you?" Alana and her daughter-in-law swooped in, hugging Susan. "We can't argue with that, can we, Brittany?" Alana asked. "No, and I know God has brought the two of you together." Again Susan's mother dabbed at her eyes. "Come on, don't dawdle," she grinned, thrusting a bouquet of pink and white roses into Susan's hands. "Your father will have his tie off before you're under the arches at this rate." Together the three women laughed, opening the door and stepping out onto a perfectly manicured lawn. Susan had decided that she wanted her wedding to take place at her ancestral home under a bright Georgia sun, much to her grandmother's delight. The entire house had been turned upside down, the large kitchen was now a caterer's dream, and the backyard looked like something from a romance movie set. Pots of late fall flowers held a white paper path against the slightest breeze. Several of her friends, draped in modern dresses of the palest peach, waited at the end of the line, where a tall white arch took center stage. Susan squeezed her father's arm, her stomach full of butterflies. "I'm ready," she whispered, looking up at the man who had given her his love and strength throughout the years. "I'm not," Mr. Holmes smiled, patting her hand. "I am happy for you, sweetheart," he added, leaning down and kissing her cheek. "You picked a real keeper." Susan's light laugh echoed down the gossamer pathway, lifting David's eyes in her direction, and his brilliant smile outshone the sun. Even from the back of the line, she could see the love in his caramel-colored eyes. Today her whole world was changing. The old would pass away, and a new life waited on the other side of this moment. Susan's heart fluttered, taking in the handsome man in the black tuxedo, who only had eyes for her, as she fell into slow step with her father. The sun was warm on Susan's bare shoulders as her father slipped her hand into David's, and the world seemed to turn, shifting and righting itself as David squeezed her fingers in his. "Hi, beautiful," David whispered, turning them both to face the preacher as a sense of peace engulfed Susan. She had given her whole being to God, and now, he had given her heart to the wonderful man at her side. Susan smiled as the preacher began to speak, soaking in the joyous wonder of the day. The truth of the vows, their solid promise sealing her heart to David as words were spoken and rings exchanged. She never could have believed that a few questions about the mysterious painted ponies could have led to this day. What a wondrous and marvelous world. The ceremony turned to the reception, a huge affair in the backyard that extended to the wide wraparound porch, graced with propane heaters, to ward off the chill for those more susceptible to cold. Susan giggled as David took her hand, leading her out onto a small wooden dance floor that had been erected for the occasion. "I'm glad you're happy," he said, pulling her close as the music began. "I am." Susan looked up, her blue eyes full of love and joy. "I'm also laughing because half the people here are your cousins." David's chuckle rolled through her as they began to dance. "I do have a lot of cousins." The handsome man led her around the dance floor while others began to join them, moving to the music with light steps. "Is that your grandmother?" David looked over Susan's shoulder, spinning her so that she could see. "Oh my goodness, Gram is dancing with Mr. Codens." Susan gaped. "They're cutting a rug too, if I remember my terminology right." David chuckled again. "Do you think she likes him, David?" Susan laughed, turning her attention back to him. "My grandmother likes everyone." David twirled his beautiful wife as the music continued. He never would have believed this day would come. "She does have good taste," he grinned again. "After all, she loves me." How could anyone resist such charm? Susan slipped closer, looking up into David's eyes. "I couldn't." David lowered his head as the world around him faded, leaving only the two of them on the earth as his lips met hers once more. The whoops and loud cheers of their guests pulled the couple back to reality, and David laughed again at the bright blush on Susan's face. "Is it truly over?" Susan asked, holding tight to David's hand as they gazed down at the gravestone on the hill. "It is," David replied, tracing the newly added date on the headstone. "Grandpa can rest in peace now." "I can't believe that Clark confessed to everything, even telling the police where he had buried Pap. I think the guilt of all those years must have weighed heavily on him. He's an old man with not long to live if the doctors are to be believed." David nodded, wrapping an arm around his young bride. They had returned from a honeymoon in Virginia to find that the family had moved Harcourt's remains to rest beside his beloved wife. She never once doubted him. All those years of rumors and questions, and she never doubted once. She loved him, Susan said, turning to face the man she loved with all her heart. "It's sad that they didn't have all those years together. I know she missed him. She used to tell me stories about when they were young. I always hoped and prayed that I would find someone to love like that, and now, I have you." Susan felt the prickle of tears behind her eyes. "Just before we wed, Graham told me something. She said that from the time I was born she had prayed for my husband. She had prayed that God would send the perfect mate for me. Someone who would love, honor, and cherish me, quirks and all. Now that I have you, I know her prayers have been answered." David leaned in, kissing his beautiful wife as tears of joy and sorrow mingled. He regretted all the years that he never had with his grandfather, but he wouldn't trade the treasure in his arms for the whole world. "I'm glad we came to see this," David said, pulling Susan close. "Who knows, someday when we have a little tiff, I can come out and ask Pap for some advice." David blew out a breath as Susan poked him in the stomach. "We are not going to fight," she stated. "We may have disagreements or even misunderstandings, but no fights." David squeezed her close again, chuckling until she laughed. "I don't care if we have disagreements or arguments as long as you love me. With a little faith, a lot of dedication, and a load of love, we'll be all right. Just look at the examples we have had in our lives." Susan felt her heart swell, filling with a deep and lasting love for the man she had met not so long ago. He was everything she could ever dream of. A partner, friend, companion, and fellow part-time sleuth. God had blessed her with her heart's desire. She had been seeking for truth, for answers, but what she found was love.